The wind came before dawn. Caleb Merritt tasted it first metallic bone-dry cold, the kind that promised a storm before nightfall. He had learned to read weather the way other men read newspapers, and right now every sign told him to stay inside, stoke the fire, and wait out whatever the sky planned to throw at him. But the horses were restless. He stood on the cabin porch, coffee steaming in his tin cup, watching the way his three mares shifted and stamped in the corral. Their ears kept swiveling toward the eastern ridge. That bothered him more than the dropping temperature. Animals knew things before people did. They felt trouble the way a man felt a splinter working deeper into his palm. He set down his coffee and reached for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Not because he expected trouble out here, 100 miles from anything resembling civilization. Trouble usually announced itself with plenty of warning. But 12 years of living alone on this land had taught him that preparation and paranoia looked remarkably similar, and only one of them kept you alive. The sun wasn't up yet. The world existed in that strange blue darkness before dawn, where everything looked like a bruise and shadows stretched longer than they had any right to. Caleb stepped off the porch, boots crunching through the frozen crust of yesterday's snow, and started toward the corral. That's when he saw her, a shape dark against the white expanse of his eastern fence line. At first he thought it was a deer, then a wolf, but as his eyes adjusted, the shape resolved into something that made his chest tighten. A woman, standing at his gate, not leaning, not collapsed, standing upright with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of either pride or terror, maybe both. The wind caught whatever she was wearing and whipped it around her legs. Even from 50 yards away, Caleb could see she was shaking. He raised the rifle, not pointing at her, but ready. "State your business," he called out, his voice cutting through the wind. The woman didn't move, didn't run, didn't answer. She simply stood there and watched him approach. As Caleb got closer, details emerged that made the situation stranger with every step. She was wearing a dress, not a traveling dress, not work clothes, nothing practical. A formal dress, silk from the look of it, in a color that had no business being anywhere near a Wyoming winter. Pink, bright, delicate pink like cherry blossoms, or a painting he'd once seen in a Philadelphia parlor before he burned that entire life to ash. The dress was torn, the hem ragged and stained with mud and what might have been blood. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, tangled with bits of prairie grass and ice. But her face was composed, calm even. She watched Caleb approach with eyes that didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't show fear. They simply assessed him with the same careful attention he was giving her. He stopped 10 feet away, the rifle still in his hands but lowered now. Up close he could see she was Chinese. Her features delicate but hardened by something Caleb recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. This was a woman who had survived things that should have killed her. "You lost?" he asked, though it seemed like the most foolish question in the world. Of course she was lost. Nobody ended up at Caleb Merritt's ranch on purpose. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, accented but clear. "I found exactly what I was looking for." Caleb waited. The wind howled around them and he watched her sway slightly, catching herself before she fell. She was barely standing. Whatever had brought her here, she was running on fumes and willpower. "Which is?" he prompted. "A man alone," she said. "Far from town, far from everything." The hair on the back of his neck stood up. This felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the obvious wrongness of a Chinese woman in a silk dress appearing on his ranch before dawn. This felt like the beginning of something he wouldn't be able to walk away from. "I need to know who you are and why you're here," Caleb said, and this time his voice carried the edge of a command. "Right now." The woman took a breath. For the first time, something flickered across her face, not fear exactly. More like the expression of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing there was no other option. "My name is Mei Lin," she said, "and I need you to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" She looked at him with those steady, unflinching eyes and spoke words that would replay in Caleb's mind for the rest of his life. "Kill me," she said calmly, "or be my husband." The world seemed to stop. The wind died for just a moment, and in that pocket of silence, Caleb heard his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He'd heard a lot of strange things in his life, desperate words, dying words, the kind of words that came out when people had nothing left to lose. But he'd never heard anything like this. "What?" The word came out rougher than he intended. Maylin didn't repeat herself. She just watched him waiting. And Caleb realized with sick certainty that she meant every word. This wasn't hysteria. This wasn't madness. This was a woman who had calculated her options down to two, and she was presenting them to him as plainly as a balance sheet. I don't understand, Caleb said. You don't need to understand, Malin replied. You only need to choose. If you kill me, I die free. If you marry me, I live protected. Either way, I will never go back to the men who think they own me. There it was, the truth underneath the impossible request. Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle, and he found himself scanning the horizon looking for riders, for pursuit, for whatever nightmare she'd run from. Who's coming? I don't know. Maybe no one. Maybe everyone. Her voice remained even. But if they find me alone unmarried, they'll take me back. If they find me dead, they'll leave. If they find me married to an American rancher. She paused, and something that might have been hope flickered in her expression. They might decide I'm not worth the trouble. She had planned this. Somehow running through a frozen prairie in a torn silk dress, she had planned this. Caleb didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. I could just give you shelter, he said. Help you get to the next town wherever you're trying to go. I'm not trying to go anywhere, Malin interrupted. I'm trying to disappear. And a Chinese woman traveling alone? She shook her head. I might as well paint a target on my back. But a married woman with a husband to vouch for her, she left the rest unspoken. Caleb's mind raced. This was insane. All of it. You didn't marry strangers who showed up at your gate making ultimatums. You didn't shoot them either, no matter what they asked. You sent them on their way, and you definitely didn't get involved in whatever trouble they were running from. But as he looked at Malin, really looked at her, he saw something that made his chest ache with recognition. She was doing exactly what Caleb himself had done 12 years ago, when he'd left everything behind and come west to build a life where no one could touch him. She was burning every bridge and praying the fire wouldn't catch up. I need time to think, Caleb said. There is no time. Malin's voice didn't waver. They could be an hour behind me. They could be a day. But they're coming. When they arrive, you need to have an answer ready. Are you going to help me or not? The wind picked up again. With it came the first stinging flakes of fresh snow. The storm Caleb had tasted in the air all morning was arriving right on schedule, and suddenly he understood what Malin had gambled on. Men tracking a runaway woman through a Wyoming blizzard would turn back. Weather this bad would erase her tracks, make the search too costly to continue. If she could just survive until the storm passed. Caleb looked at the sky, calculating. An hour, maybe less, before the worst of it hit. Come inside, he said, making the decision before he could second-guess it. Before you freeze to death and make the choice for me. Something shifted in Malin's expression. Not quite relief, but close to it. She took a step toward the gate and her legs buckled. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. The first thing he noticed was how cold she was. Through the thin silk, he could feel her whole body shaking with cold so deep it had gone past pain into numbness. Her skin was ice. Her lips were tinged blue. How long have you been walking? He demanded. Since yesterday afternoon? Malin said, her voice fainter now that her composure was cracking. I ran when I could, walked when I couldn't. 18 hours, maybe more. 18 hours. In freezing temperatures. In a silk party dress. Caleb felt anger flash through him, not at her, but at whoever had put her in a position where this seemed like the better option. He shifted her weight, preparing to carry her to the cabin. Malin's hand shot out and gripped his arm. Surprisingly strong. I need your answer, she said. Before I go inside, before I take anything from you, kill me or marry me, which is it? Caleb looked down at her, the stranger who'd stumbled into his life with an impossible request and eyes that had seen too much. He thought about the quiet life he'd built here, the careful solitude he'd cultivated. He thought about the complications that would come with this choice, the questions, the suspicion, the danger she'd warned him about. Then he thought about the alternative, sending her back out into the storm. Watching her walk away, knowing what came next would be worse than freezing. I'm not going to kill you, Caleb said quietly. Malin's eyes searched his face, fear there for the first time. And I'm not going to marry you, he continued, watching her expression begin to shatter. Not right now, not like this. But I'm not sending you back out there either. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come inside, get warm, eat something. Then we're both going to wait out this storm. And when it's over, when you've had time to rest and I've had time to think, we'll talk about what comes next. That's the only offer I'm making. It wasn't what she wanted. He could see the protest forming on her lips, the argument about time and danger and men who might be coming. But her body betrayed her. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. and practical necessity won out over desperate planning. "All right," she whispered. Caleb lifted her easily. She weighed almost nothing and carried her toward the cabin. Behind them, the wind erased their footprints as the storm rolled in. And for better or worse, Maylin disappeared into the Wyoming wilderness as completely as she'd appeared. Mine. The cabin was small. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace dividing them, rough-hewn furniture shelves holding supplies and a few worn books. No decorations, no comfort beyond basic function. It was a place built for survival, not living. Caleb set Maylin down in the chair nearest the fire and immediately began building up the flames. She didn't speak. She watched him move around the space with those careful, assessing eyes, and he was acutely aware suddenly of how sparse it all was, how empty. "Can you move your fingers?" he asked without looking at her. A pause. "Yes." "Toes?" "I think so." "Good. No frostbite, or at least nothing severe enough to stop circulation." Caleb grabbed a blanket from his bed and brought it over, draping it across her shoulders. Then he knelt to check her feet. The silk slippers she wore were more decorative than functional, soaked through and nearly frozen solid. He pulled them off gently and examined her feet, red and raw, but the toes moved when he touched them. "Another hour and you'd have lost these," he said. "I know," Maylin said softly. "I've seen frostbite before." Caleb wanted to ask where, wanted to ask everything, but he filed the questions away. First things first, get her warm. Get food in her, make sure she survived the night. Everything else could wait. He put water on to heat and pulled out the previous night's leftover stew, setting it near the fire to warm. Then he found a spare shirt, clean, heavy flannel, far too large for her, but warm and dry, and handed it to her along with a pair of wool socks. "Change out of that dress," he said, turning his back to give her privacy. "It's killing you." He heard the rustle of wet silk, the quiet sounds of her struggling with cold, stiff fingers. "Done," she said after a long moment. Caleb turned back. Maylin was swimming in his flannel shirt sleeves, rolled up multiple times, the hem falling to her knees. Her wet hair was plastered against her neck. She'd wrapped the blanket around herself like armor. She looked younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 25, maybe 30. Hard to tell when someone was that exhausted. She also looked terrified. The composure she'd shown at the gate was gone now, stripped away by warmth and safety, and the simple human reaction to realizing she'd survived. Her hands shook as she clutched the blanket. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hey," Caleb said quietly, crouching in front of her. "You're safe. Right now in this moment, you're safe." Maylin nodded and the shaking got worse. Caleb recognized what was happening. He'd seen it in men after battles, after disasters, after the moment of crisis passed and the body finally understood what it had survived. Delayed shock hitting all at once. He grabbed the cup of hot water, steeped now with some of the herbs he kept for rough nights, chamomile and mint, nothing fancy but warm, and pressed it into her hands. "Drink," he said, slowly. She obeyed. Gradually the shaking subsided. Color started returning to her face, replacing the deathly pallor. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury and snow battered the cabin walls. But inside, the fire crackled and warmth settled over everything like a second blanket. He served her the stew. She ate mechanically, like someone who'd forgotten what hunger felt like, but whose body remembered how to respond to food. Caleb let her eat in silence, using the time to shore up the fire and check that the shutters were latched tight against the storm. When she finished, he set the bowl aside and pulled the second chair over to sit across from her. "All right," he said. "Now we talk." Maylin looked up at him. The composure was back, settled over her features like a mask. She straightened despite her exhaustion, meeting his eyes directly. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Caleb said. "Start at the beginning. Who are you really and who's coming after you?" "Yeah." She took a breath. And Caleb watched her choose her words carefully, the way a person does when the truth is too large to say all at once and must be rationed out piece by piece. "I was married," she began, "in San Francisco. My husband was a merchant, a good man. We had a small shop, a small life. Nothing grand, but it was ours." Her voice remained steady, her hands tightened on the blanket. "He died 3 years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry," Caleb said and meant it. Maylin nodded, a brief acknowledgement. "In my culture, a widow with no children and no family is vulnerable. I tried to keep the shop running, but there were debts I didn't know about, men who claimed my husband owed them money. Men who said I now owed them money. And you couldn't pay. I could have paid," Maylin said, and there was steel in her voice now, "if the debt had been real. But it wasn't about money, it was about control. They wanted the shop. They wanted me." She said the last words with quiet fury. "So you ran?" "At first I tried to fight legally, But the courts in San Francisco for someone like me, she shook her head. They wouldn't hear me. So I sold what I could, paid what I must, and tried to start over. I took a job in a restaurant, kept my head down, thought I was safe. But you weren't. No, the word came out bitter. The men who wanted the shop found out where I was working. They made an arrangement with the restaurant owner. He would keep me there working off my debt. They would leave his business alone. She paused. I became property, passed between men who thought they had the right to own me. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd heard stories like this before, though never told directly by someone who'd lived them. The territories were full of people escaping things. But women, especially immigrant women, faced a particular kind of hell when the world decided they were disposable. The restaurant owner decided to move his business east, Malin continued, to Denver, where the railroad was bringing money. He brought me with him along with two other women. We were assets, part of his inventory. Jesus, Caleb muttered. Malin's expression didn't change. In Denver, the restaurant was a front for other business. The kind where women like me were expected to. She stopped. For the first time, she couldn't quite meet his eyes. You understand. I understand, Caleb said quietly. I was kept in a room on the third floor, locked in, bars on the windows. I wasn't allowed to leave. She looked up then, and the fury was back clean and sharp as the blade. 2 days ago, they moved me from Denver, me and one other woman, both of us locked in a wagon headed for Red Hollow. Caleb's blood went cold. Red Hollow was the nearest settlement to his ranch, barely 30 miles southeast, close enough that the mention of it made all of this suddenly terrifyingly real. The plan was to establish a new operation there, Malin said, somewhere remote enough that people wouldn't ask too many questions about where the women came from. How did you get away? For the first time, something that might have been satisfaction flickered across her face. The wagon lost a wheel 20 miles outside of Red Hollow. The driver and his partner had to stop to fix it. They couldn't watch both of us and repair the wagon at the same time. So when night fell and they were distracted, she gestured at herself. I ran, in this dress. It was what I was wearing when they took me. They kept us in our best clothes for presentation when we arrived. The bitterness in her voice could have cut steel. I ran south, away from the road into the dark. I didn't have a plan beyond getting away. I walked all night, all the next day. I hid when I saw riders. I kept moving when I wanted to stop. And then I saw your ranch. How did you know I was alone? Malin met his eyes. I watched for 4 hours before I approached. I saw you working alone. Saw no woman come out of the cabin, no children. Just one man living by himself, far from everything. She paused. You were exactly what I needed. Caleb should have been disturbed by that admission that she had watched him calculated. Him approached him as a solution to a problem. Instead, he found himself impressed by her survival instinct. The men from the wagon, he said, are they looking for you? I assume so, but the storm will slow them. She lifted her chin. And if I'm married to you, legally protected by that bond, they won't be able to simply take me. Not easily. These men don't want difficulty. They want easy profit. A runaway wife isn't worth the trouble of fighting a legal battle against an American citizen. It was a gamble. A huge, desperate gamble built on assumptions about what men would or wouldn't do, what the law would or wouldn't protect. But Caleb couldn't argue with her logic. Out here, a married woman was her husband's responsibility under the law, and any man trying to take her would have to go through him legally and physically. So that's why you asked, Caleb said slowly, kill you or marry you, freedom or protection? Yes. Her voice was steady again. If you kill me, I die free. They can't take me back to that room. Can't sell me, can't use me. If you marry me, the law protects me at least on paper. And if I refuse both, she shrugged, then I'll leave at first light and take my chances alone. Caleb believed her. He could see it in her eyes. This woman would rather freeze to death on the prairie than go back to what she'd escaped. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the storm raged, snow already piling against the cabin walls, visibility down to almost nothing. Nothing was moving out there except the wind and the cold. If men were searching for Malin, they'd have to wait until this passed, which gave them time. Not much, but some. I won't kill you, Caleb said, still facing the window. That's not happening. You understand me? I don't care what you ask or how desperate things get. I'm not doing that. All right, Malin said softly, and I won't marry you today. He turned to face her. Not because I'm refusing to help, but if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Legal witness something that will actually protect you if men come asking questions. He held her gaze. The storm will last through tomorrow, maybe into the next day. When it clears, we ride to Red Hollow. There's a preacher there. We get married properly with papers with names in a registry. Then if anyone comes looking for you, they'll find a legally married woman with a husband who won't let her go. Malin stared at him. You're saying yes. I'm saying I'll help you, Caleb corrected. This won't be a real marriage, you understand that. It'll be paper and protection, nothing more. You'll have your own space, your own life. I won't ask anything from you except that you pull your weight on the ranch when you're able. In return, you get a name, a legal status, and a roof over your head. When you're ready to move on, we can figure out what comes next. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was practical, and Caleb could see that Malin understood practicality better than empty promises. Why, she asked. Why would you do this? Caleb thought about how to answer. He could say it was the right thing to do, which was true. He could say he didn't want her death on his conscience, which was also true. But the real answer was older and quieter than either of those. 12 years ago, he said, I left Philadelphia with nothing but what I could carry. I had people looking for me for reasons I won't get into. I came west because I needed to disappear. Nobody out here cared who I'd been or what I'd done. They just cared whether I could survive. He met her eyes. I got my second chance. Seems only fair to give you yours. Something shifted in Malin's expression. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the foundation on which trust might eventually be built. She nodded slowly. Then I accept, she said, your terms, your conditions, all of it. Good. Caleb moved toward the back room. You'll sleep in here tonight. I'll take the chair by the fire. Tomorrow we'll start preparing for the trip to Red Hollow. Caleb, Malin said, stopping him. He turned back. Thank you, she said quietly. I know you think you're just being practical, but you're giving me something I thought I'd lost forever. A choice, the ability to decide what happens to me next. She paused, struggling with something. That's everything. Caleb nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, and gestured toward the bed. Get some rest. We'll figure the rest out as we go. He returned to the main room and settled into the chair by the fire. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, and Daniel sat there listening to the wind and the crackling fire, wondering what in the hell he'd just agreed to. But as he sat there in the flickering warmth, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For 12 years, he'd built his life around isolation and self-sufficiency. He'd convinced himself that being alone was the same as being safe. Now, with a stranger sleeping in his bed and danger somewhere in the storm beyond his walls, Caleb realized how empty that safety had become. He didn't sleep much that night. He kept the fire going, kept his rifle close, and listened for sounds that might mean riders approaching through the blizzard. But the only sounds were wind and snow, and once soft crying from the back room that stopped before he could decide whether to acknowledge it. When dawn came gray and muted through the storm, Caleb found Malin already awake. She stood in the bedroom doorway in his flannel shirt, dark hair loose around her shoulders. The storm's not letting up, she observed. No, Caleb agreed. We'll be stuck here at least another day, maybe two. Malin nodded, accepting this. Then she surprised him by asking, what needs to be done around the ranch, I mean? I can't sit idle while you work. Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd run through a blizzard, collapsed at his gate and proposed marriage at gunpoint, and felt the corner of his mouth twitch towards something that might have been a smile. You can start by helping me keep this fire going, he said. Then we'll see about getting some real food into both of us. After that, he gestured vaguely at the cabin. Everything else can wait until the weather breaks. It was a strange day, that first full day of the storm. They moved around each other like dancers, learning new steps, careful, respectful of the space between them, hyper-aware of the strangeness of their situation. Malin insisted on helping prepare meals, and Caleb showed her where he kept his meager supplies. She mended her pink dress with supplies from his sewing kit, her stitches small and precise despite her worn hands. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd both spent enough time alone to understand that quiet didn't mean rejection. By evening, as the storm continued to rage, they sat across from each other at the small table sharing a meal of beans and cornbread. And Caleb realized with something like surprise that he didn't mind the company. Can I ask you something? Malin said. Go ahead. Why did you come west? You said you needed to disappear. From what? Caleb considered deflecting. Then he remembered how much she'd shared the night before and decided she'd earned honesty. My family, he said. specifically my father. He had plans for my life that didn't match the life I wanted. When I refused to follow them, things got complicated. Complicated how? Stay and submit to his will or leave and never come back. Caleb stared at his plate. I chose to leave. Haven't spoken to any of them since. Malin absorbed this. Do you regret it? No, Caleb said immediately. Best decision I ever made. This land is hard, it's lonely, but it's mine. Nobody tells me who to be or what to want. That's worth more than comfort or family approval. Yes, Malin said softly, it is. They finished the meal in renewed silence, and Caleb felt a thread of understanding pass between them. They were both exiles in their own ways, both people who had chosen freedom over belonging. The storm finally broke on the third day, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow that glittered in the weak winter sunlight. Caleb spent the morning digging out the cabin and checking on his horses. Malin watched from the porch wrapped in blankets. We'll leave tomorrow, Caleb told her when he came back inside, stamping snow off his boots. Ground's too soft today, but it should firm up overnight. We'll make Red Hollow by afternoon if we start early. Malin nodded, and for the first time since that first night, Caleb saw nervousness flicker across her face. What if they're there, she asked. The men from the wagon. Then we deal with it, Caleb said simply. But Malin, once we do this, once we stand in front of witnesses and say those vows, this becomes real in the eyes of the law. You'll be my wife on paper. Anyone who wants to take you will have to go through legal channels. And I won't make that easy. He paused. You are sure about this? Once we do this, your life changes too, Malin said. You'll be tied to my trouble. People will talk. They'll ask questions. Let them talk, Caleb said. Let them ask. I've been alone for 12 years. A few questions won't kill me. That evening, as they prepared for an early departure the next morning, Caleb found Malin sitting by the fire. She was holding the pink silk dress in her lap, running her fingers over the mended tears. Her expression was distant. You don't have to wear that, Caleb said gently. I have extra clothes. No, Malin interrupted. I'll wear this. It's all I have of my old life, the life I chose before everything went wrong. If I'm going to start over, I want to carry at least one piece of what I was into, what I'm becoming. Caleb understood that. He'd brought almost nothing from Philadelphia, but the few things he had carried, he'd never let go of. They were anchors to a past he couldn't return to, but refused to completely forget. It's beautiful, he said. The dress, even torn, it's beautiful. Malin looked up at him, surprised. Thank you, she said. They left at dawn, 2 horses moving through a landscape transformed by snow. Caleb led the way on his sturdy gelding, while Malin rode one of the mares, her pink dress visible like a beacon against the white prairie. She had braided her hair and carried herself with quiet dignity, despite everything. Caleb found himself respecting her composure more with every passing mile. Red Hollow appeared just after noon, a scattering of buildings clinging to existence at the edge of nowhere. A general store, a saloon, a handful of houses, and a small white building that served as both school and church depending on the day of the week. As they rode down the single street, Caleb felt eyes tracking them. Windows opened, doors cracked. Within minutes, it seemed the entire population of Red Hollow, all 40-some souls, had found reasons to be outside. Caleb ignored them. He helped Malin dismount in front of the church, tied both horses to the rail, then turned to face the gathering crowd. I need to see Reverend Walsh, he announced, and Mary Chen. Anyone know where they are? A tall man Caleb recognized as the general store owner stepped forward. Daniel Hayes, Caleb didn't expect to see you in town for another month at least. Plans changed, Frank, Caleb said evenly. Frank's eyes slid to Malin, taking in every detail. The Reverend's inside, but Caleb, his voice dropped. Maybe you want to explain? No, Caleb interrupted. I don't want to explain anything. This is Malin. We're here to get married. That's all anyone needs to know. The murmur that went through the crowd was immediate and loud. Caleb heard fragments, Chinese mail order scandal, but he kept his eyes forward, his hand resting at the small of Malin's back in a gesture that was both protective and clear. You sure about this? Frank asked, and there was genuine concern beneath the judgment. This is going to complicate your life, Caleb. I'm sure, Caleb said. Now, are you going to get the Reverend, or do I need to go in there myself? Frank held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded and disappeared into the church. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, more people gathered. Caleb felt Malin trembling beside him, though her face remained composed. He leaned close and murmured, You all right? They hate me already, she whispered back. They don't know you, Caleb corrected, and their opinions don't matter. We're not doing this for them. Reverend Walsh emerged from the church, a thin man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a perpetual expression of careful concern. Behind him came Mary Chen, the school teacher, one of the few other Chinese residents of Red Hollow, and the only one Caleb had ever spoken more than 2 words to. "Mr. Merritt," the Reverend said carefully, "Frank says you're here to be married." "That's right. Today, if possible, with witnesses." The Reverend's eyes moved to Mei Lin, and Caleb saw sympathy there, which was better than judgment. "And the young lady, she wishes this as well." "I do," Mei Lin said. Her voice was clear and strong despite the trembling Caleb could still feel beside him. Mary Chen stepped forward, studying Mei Lin with sharp, assessing eyes. Then she did something unexpected. She spoke in rapid Chinese, a string of words Caleb couldn't follow. Mei Lin responded in the same language, and something passed between them that Caleb couldn't understand but felt the weight of. Finally, Mary nodded. She turned to Reverend Walsh. "She knows what she's doing," Mary said, "and she's doing it freely. I'll witness." The Reverend looked between all of them, clearly wanting to ask more questions, clearly sensing there was a bigger story here. But he was a good man, and good men sometimes understood when not to pry. "All right," he said, "let's go inside." The ceremony was brief, witnessed by Mary Chen, and to Caleb's surprise, Frank from the general store, who had apparently decided to see this through despite his doubts. They stood in the small church that smelled of dust and old hymn books, and Reverend Walsh spoke the familiar words about marriage and commitment and permanence. When he asked about rings, Caleb shook his head, but Mei Lin surprised him. She reached into the pocket of her pink dress and pulled out a thin gold band. Her wedding ring from her first marriage, Caleb realized. "Use this," she said softly, holding it out to him. So Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger as he repeated the vows, and Mei Lin promised to honor and cherish him until death parted them. Through it all, Caleb kept thinking, this is insane. This is the most insane thing I've ever done. But when Reverend Walsh pronounced them married and told Caleb he could kiss his bride, and Caleb leaned forward to press the lightest, most chaste kiss imaginable to Mei Lin's lips, he felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. They signed the papers. Mary and Frank signed as witnesses. Reverend Walsh recorded the marriage in his registry, making it official, making it real, making it law. Just like that, Caleb Merritt had a wife. They emerged from the church to find the crowd had grown. Word had spread fast. As they prepared to leave, a group of riders appeared at the far end of the street, 4 men moving slowly through the snow, their eyes scanning the buildings and the people until they landed on Mei Lin. Caleb's hand dropped into his rifle. The lead rider was well-dressed for the frontier, wool coat, clean, had of boots that hadn't seen much honest work. He sat his horse with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His eyes locked onto Mei Lin with the focused intensity of a hunter spotting prey. Caleb positioned his horse between Mei Lin and the approaching riders. The well-dressed man reined in about 20 feet away. His 3 companions spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. "Afternoon," the man said pleasantly. "Name's Victor Crane. I'm looking for a woman who may have passed through here recently. Chinese, wearing a pink dress." His gaze slid past Caleb to Mei Lin, and recognition flashed across his face. "There she is." His voice shifted, still polite, but with an edge underneath. "Ma'am, you've caused quite a bit of trouble. Time to come back with us." "She's not going anywhere," Caleb said. His voice was flat, hard. Crane's attention snapped back to Caleb. The pleasant mask slipped just a fraction. "I don't believe that's your decision, friend. This woman is bound by contract to work for my employer. She ran before completing her obligations. That makes her a thief." "That's a lie," Mei Lin said. Her voice shook but held. "I was never under contract. I was taken against my will and held prisoner." Crane addressed the crowd, now playing to the audience. "My employer paid good money to transport her to Red Hollow, provided food and shelter, and this is how she repays that generosity, by running off in the night and making false accusations." Caleb watched the crowd's reaction, saw doubt creeping into some faces. Crane was good at this. He knew how to make a victim look like the villain. "Doesn't matter what your employer paid," Caleb said. "This woman is my wife. We were married not 10 minutes ago with proper witnesses and legal documentation. Whatever claim you think you have, you can take it up with the judge. She's not leaving with you today." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Crane seemed momentarily stunned. Then his eyes narrowed. "Your wife, how convenient." He looked at Caleb with something close to contempt. "You expect me to believe you just happened to marry a runaway woman the same day I arrived looking for her?" "Reverend Walsh," Caleb said without breaking eye contact with Crane, "you want to confirm what just happened in your church?" The Reverend stepped forward, his expression troubled but honest. It's true, I married Caleb Merritt and Mei Lin not 15 minutes ago. Signed and witnessed, all legal and proper. Crane's jaw tightened. This is fraud, a sham marriage designed to hide stolen property. Watch your mouth, Caleb said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You're talking about my wife. One of Crane's men shifted in the saddle, the subtle creak of leather that meant someone repositioning for a better draw. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Then Frank stepped forward, surprising everyone. Mr. Crane, I don't know anything about your employer or your business, but I do know Caleb Merritt. He's been ranching out here for 12 years. Never caused trouble. Never lied to anyone in this town. If he says he married this woman, then he married her. And the law is pretty clear about what that means. The law is also clear about contract obligations, Crane shot back. This woman owes my employer compensation for breach of agreement. At minimum, she needs to return to Denver to settle accounts. She's not going to Denver, Caleb said. She's coming home with me. If your employer has a legal grievance, he can file it with the territorial court. But he'll have to prove his claim, and from what my wife has told me, that's going to be difficult since there was no legitimate contract to begin with. Then Mary Chen stepped forward. Before you start making threats about the law, Mr. Crane, she said, her voice calm and precise, you might want to consider how well your employer's business dealings will hold up under scrutiny. Human trafficking is illegal in this territory, regardless of whatever papers you claim to have. Crane's face went hard. You're making serious accusations. So are you, Mary replied. The difference is I can prove mine if it comes to that. Can you prove yours? The standoff stretched out, tense, fragile. Caleb kept his hand near his rifle, watching Crane's men. But Crane was smart enough to recognize when pushing would cost more than backing down. His employer might want Mei Lin back, but not badly enough to start a shooting war in the middle of a Wyoming settlement with dozens of witnesses. This isn't over, Crane said finally. His voice was tight, controlled. My employer will pursue legal remedies. You'll be hearing from lawyers, Mr. Merritt. And when they prove this marriage is fraudulent, your wife will be returned to complete her obligations. Looking forward to it, Caleb said flatly. Now get off my street. Crane stared at him for a long moment. Then he jerked his reins, turned his horse, and rode out of Red Hollow at a measured pace that said he wasn't retreating, just postponing. Caleb didn't relax until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Even then, his hand stayed near the rifle. He helped Mei Lin down from her horse. She was shaking so badly she could barely stand. You did good, he said quietly. It's not over, she whispered. You heard him. They'll come back. With lawyers, documents. Then we'll fight it, Caleb said. But right now we need to go home. He paused on that last word, hearing how it sounded. Can you ride? Mei Lin nodded, and they mounted up and started the long ride back to the ranch. They were half a mile out of Red Hollow when Mary Chen caught up to them riding hard. Wait, she called. Caleb reined in immediately. What's wrong? Mary pulled alongside them, slightly breathless. I wanted to talk to you both before you left away from the gossips. She looked at Mei Lin directly. What you said back there about being held prisoner. It's true, isn't it? They were trafficking you. Mei Lin hesitated, then nodded. I thought so, Mary said. I've heard rumors about operations like this coming out of Denver. Women brought in under false pretenses, forced into service, kept through debt and threats. She paused. The thing is, Crane was right about one thing. If they have any kind of paperwork, even fraudulent paperwork, it's going to be hard to fight. The law doesn't always distinguish between legitimate contracts and coerced ones, especially when the person being coerced is Chinese. So what do we do? Caleb asked. You need documentation of your own, Mary said. Letters, testimonies, anything that establishes Mei Lin's true history and proves the trafficking claim. And Caleb, you need to document this marriage. Not just the certificate, letters to old contacts, anything that makes it clear this is a real relationship, not a convenience. She looked at him steadily. Because if Crane comes back with lawyers, they're going to try to prove it's fraud. You need to be ready to prove it's not. Caleb absorbed this. Mary was right. The marriage had been the first step. Protecting it was going to require more. Thank you, Mei Lin said softly, for speaking up back there. You didn't have to. Mary smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Caleb had seen from her. Yes, I did. We take care of our own out here. She paused. Mei Lin, if you need someone to talk to who understands what it's like to be Chinese in a place like this, you know where to find me. She turned her horse and rode back toward Red Hollow. Caleb and Mei Lin rode in silence for a while. both of them processing what had just happened. "I'm sorry," Malin said eventually. "For what?" "For bringing this to your door, for putting you in danger, for," she gestured helplessly, "everything." "Stop," Caleb said. "You didn't bring anything to my door that I didn't agree to take on. I knew there were risks when I said yes, and I'd make the same choice again." "Why?" Her voice was genuinely curious. "Because you deserved a choice," he said, "and because I could give you one." That seemed like enough reason. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of gold and pink that matched Malin's dress exactly. Caleb helped her down from the horse and began unsaddling the animals. Malin stood on the porch looking out at the land that was now legally at least partly hers. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's hard," Caleb corrected. "Beautiful, yes, but hard. Winters that'll freeze you solid, summers that'll bake you dry, and loneliness that'll drive you crazy if you let it." He paused. "You sure you want this?" Malin turned to face him. In the fading light, he saw determination in her eyes that matched anything he'd felt when he first came west. "I want freedom," she said. "I want the ability to choose my own life. If that comes with hard winters and loneliness, I'll take it. It's still better than what I left behind." Caleb nodded, understood completely. "Then welcome home, Mrs. Merritt." The name seemed to startle her. She repeated it softly, testing it out. "That's who I am now," Caleb said, "on paper." "On paper," Malin agreed. And there was something in her tone, something Caleb couldn't quite read as she turned and walked inside. He stood on the porch a moment longer, listening to the prairie settle into evening. The horses were calm now. The storm was gone. The night ahead was quiet. He thought about the woman in the pink dress who had appeared at his gate before dawn with an impossible request and eyes that had survived impossible things. He thought about the choice she had offered him and the choice he had made. Neither of them could have known what came next. But as the last light faded over the Wyoming prairie, Caleb Merritt walked back into his cabin, which was no longer quite his alone, and felt for the first time in 12 years that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first weeks back at the ranch settled into something Caleb hadn't expected: rhythm. Not the lonely rhythm he'd lived with for 12 years, where days bled into each other like water into dry ground, and the only measure of time was the weather and the work. This was something different, a rhythm with a second heartbeat in it, another presence moving through the same spaces, breathing the same air, claiming small portions of the same quiet. Malin didn't take much. She wasn't the kind of person who took much. But she was there, and the cabin knew it. Within 3 days, she had organized his chaotic supply shelves into a system that made immediate sense. Within 5, she had the chicken coop cleaned and restructured, so the hen's 3 elderly birds Caleb had largely ignored for months were producing twice as many eggs. Within a week, she was handling the morning animal care without supervision, moving through the corral with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to read animals the way Caleb read the weather. "You're good at this," he observed one morning watching her curry one of the mares with long practice strokes. "I ran a shop for 2 years," Malin replied without looking up. "You learn to work with whatever is in front of you." Caleb built a partition down the middle of the single bedroom. Rough lumber with gaps that let sound through, not beautiful, but it gave them each a private space with separate entrances from the main room. He took the smaller side without comment. Malin accepted it without making it into anything. Some things were harder. At night, lying on his side of the partition, Caleb could hear Malin's breathing in the darkness. Sometimes it was steady and deep, and he told himself she was sleeping. Other times it was shallow, irregular, broken by small sounds that stopped before they became anything he could name. On those nights, he lay still with his rifle within reach and let her have whatever space the darkness required. She never asked for help. He never offered what she hadn't asked for. But in the morning, she was always already up when he woke. The fire built back up water onto heat, moving through the cabin with a quiet efficiency that told him she had slept enough and intended to keep moving. He had learned that keeping moving was how she stayed ahead of whatever chased her in the dark. He respected that. He had done the same thing for 12 years. So, on the 11th day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Caleb saw him coming from a mile away and immediately reached for the rifle. As the rider got closer, he recognized the mail carrier's coat, not Crane, not anyone coming for Malin, and he lowered the weapon, but he didn't put it away. "Delivery for Mr. and Mrs. Merritt," the carrier said, handing over a thick envelope. He had a satisfied smile on his face that suggested word had traveled farther than Red Hollow. "Congratulations on the marriage, by the way." After the carrier left, Caleb brought the envelope inside. Malin looked up from the pot she was stirring and saw his expression. "What is it?" Legal papers, probably. Caleb broke the seal and pulled out several documents. His jaw tightened as he read. It was from Crane's employer, a man named Aldridge Voss, operating out of Denver. They were filing suit in the territorial court. The claim was simple and brutal. Malin was bound by contract, the marriage was fraudulent, and they were demanding either her return or financial compensation for losses sustained by her breach. The number at the bottom of the demand was $5,000. The number hung in the air between them like a physical thing. How much? Malin asked, her voice very quiet. $5,000. She set down her spoon. Her face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with cold. That's Caleb. That's more than I'll see in 5 years of ranching, he confirmed. Maybe more. The silence stretched out. Outside, the wind moved through the corral and the horses stamped and shifted. Then they win, Malin said. Her voice was flat. Not defeated, something worse than defeat. Resigned. They get me back or they bankrupt you trying to keep me. Either way. No, Caleb said. She looked up at him. He set the papers down with deliberate calm. They don't win. We fight this. How you just said we don't have the money. We don't need the money, Caleb said. We need the truth. You said it yourself, there was no legitimate contract. You were trafficked, held against your will. If we can prove that the contract is void and they have no legal basis for any of this. Proving it is different from knowing it. Then we prove it. He met her eyes. Mary said we need documentation, letters, testimony, evidence. We build a case they can't dismiss. We show up in court with everything we have, and we make them prove their claims instead of just asserting them. He paused. They're counting on us being too scared or too poor to fight back. So we fight back. Malin looked at him for a long moment. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing risk against possibility, past experience, against present reality. I can write everything down, she said finally. Everything that happened. From the beginning. Names, dates, places. Then start tonight, Caleb said, and I'll write my own account. My reasons for marrying you, what you told me, what I observed. We build a record that makes the truth impossible to ignore. That evening, they sat at the small table with paper and pencil, and Malin began to write. Caleb watched her hand move across the page, careful, deliberate English letters, forming words that contained years of surviving things. No one should have to survive. She wrote for hours. When she finally set down the pencil, her hand was cramping and her eyes were red. It's all there, she said. Everything I can remember. Will it be enough? It's a start, Caleb said. Tomorrow we'll send copies to Mary. Ask her to help us find anyone else who might have witnessed what was happening in Denver. He looked at the pages she'd filled. And Malin, when we go to court, you'll have to say all of this out loud, in front of lawyers and a judge and people who will try to make you look like you're lying. Can you do that? She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that had been forged in fires he hadn't witnessed. I've already survived worse, she said. Mishan. The weeks that followed were strange and layered, the slow accumulation of a life being built in pieces, while the threat of its unbuilding waited on the horizon. During the days they worked the ranch together, Caleb taught Malin to read weather signs, to track the way deer moved before a snowstorm, to preserve food, the way the land demanded if you intended to survive until spring. She absorbed everything with focused attention that reminded him of the best kind of student, the kind who doesn't just learn the lesson, but immediately begins applying it. She learned fast, faster than he had when he'd first come west, stumbling through rookie mistakes that nearly killed him twice in the first winter. Malin had no margin for rookie mistakes, and she seemed to understand this instinctively. How do you know which plants are safe? She asked one afternoon, crouching beside a cluster of dry stems emerging from the snow near the eastern fence. Color in spring, smell, the way animals react to them. Caleb crouched beside her. These ones here see the structure. They'll come up yellow in March, safe to eat, bitter but safe. The ones right next to them will look almost identical, but the smell will be wrong. He paused. When you're not sure, watch the deer. They know. What if there are no deer? Then you don't eat it. In the evenings, they worked on their defense. Malin wrote letters to people she'd known in San Francisco. Old neighbors, the wives of her husband's business associates, anyone who might have witnessed what had happened after he died. Caleb wrote to old acquaintances in Philadelphia, people he hadn't contacted in 12 years, asking them to vouch for his character and his history. It felt strange breaking that particular silence. He had spent 12 years making himself unfindable. Now he was voluntarily leaving a trail. But he did it, for Malin. Mary Chen visited twice. The second time she brought news, the territorial court had scheduled a hearing for late spring, which gave them time to prepare but also meant months of uncertainty hanging over everything. The judge hearing the case is a man named Harrison. Mary reported sitting at Caleb's table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. Known for being fair, won't just rubber stamp whatever Crane's lawyers say. But you need to be ready for them to attack everything your character Malin's history, the legitimacy of the marriage. Let them attack it, Caleb said. I mean everything, Caleb. They're going to make you look like criminals and themselves look like victims. They're going to take everything Malin told you and find a way to make it sound like manipulation. Malin, who had been sitting quietly at the other end of the table, looked up. They already started, she said. In Red Hollow, when Crane spoke to the crowd, he made it sound like I ran out on a debt, like I was ungrateful. Because that's the story that works, Mary said. The story where they look reasonable and you look dishonest. She looked at Malin directly. So you need a better story, not a story that contradicts there's evidence that makes their story impossible. The letters I wrote are a start, but Malin, Mary paused. Are there other women from the restaurant in Denver, from the wagon women, who were in the same situation? Malin was quiet for a moment. There was one other woman in the wagon with me. Her name was Shu. I don't know what happened to her after I ran. If she was freed or if she found a way to talk to the right people, her testimony would be invaluable. Mary set down her coffee. I'll make inquiries, quietly, through connections in the Chinese community. If there's any trace of what was happening in Denver, we need to find it before the hearing. After Mary left, Caleb and Malin sat for a while in the kind of silence that had become comfortable between them. She's remarkable, Malin said. Mary, yes. She acts like this is normal, like fighting for someone she barely knows is just the obvious thing to do. It is, Caleb said. For her, I think she's been on the other side of this kind of thing. Not trafficking, exactly, but people deciding she didn't deserve the same protections as everyone else. It makes you either bitter or determined. Mary chose determined. Malin looked at him. Which did you choose? The question caught him off guard. He considered it for a moment honestly. Neither, he said. I chose gone, I just left. I didn't stay and fight. I walked away from the whole situation and built something new somewhere else. And now I'm fighting, he said simply. Better late than never, I suppose. Something shifted in Malin's expression. She looked down at the table at the papers they'd been compiling, at the evidence of a shared project spreading across the rough wood between them. I'm glad you didn't just leave, she said quietly. One evening in early March, with winter finally beginning to loosen its grip on the land, Caleb came back from checking the fence line to find Malin standing at the kitchen table holding a letter. Tears were running down her face. What's wrong? He asked immediately. She looked up. She was smiling. I got a letter back from Mrs. Wong in San Francisco. She was my husband's business partner's wife. I hadn't heard from her in 3 years. Malin held out the letter. She remembered. She believed me. She's willing to help. Caleb read the letter. Words of support, names of other witnesses, and offered to testify if needed. This is good, he said. This is exactly what we need. I know. Malin wiped her eyes. But I spent so long thinking I was alone, that no one from my old life cared what happened to me, that they'd all either forgotten me or believed the lies. She paused. People keep surprising me. You, Mary, Mrs. Wong. I wasn't expecting that. Caleb set the letter down. He acted on instinct more than thought, reached out and pulled Malin into a brief, awkward hug. She stiffened for just a moment, then relaxed. They stood like that in the small cabin, while outside the wind howled and inside the fire crackled. You're not alone, Caleb said quietly. Not anymore. When they pulled apart, something had shifted between them, not dramatically, not in any way either of them chose to acknowledge directly. But it was there, the way Malin smiled at him after, the way the air felt lighter despite the legal threat hanging over everything. Caleb noticed. He didn't know what to do with it, so he did what he had always done with things he didn't know what to do with. He filed it away and kept moving. Yeah, right. Spring came slowly. With it came mud and rain, and the first tentative green appearing in the prairie grass. Malin spent hours walking the property, learning its boundaries. One afternoon, she stopped near the south side of the cabin and stood looking at the ground for a long time. I want to put a garden here, she said. Caleb had been repairing a section of fence nearby. He straightened. Here, south-facing, good sun, protected from the north wind by the cabin. She looked at him. I know it's more work, but I want to grow things. What kind of things? Practical things first. Beans, squash, potatoes. But also, she hesitated, almost shy about it. Bok choy, bitter melon, things from home. Will they grow here? I don't know, Malin said, but I want to try. Caleb helped her prepare the ground over the following days, turning the soil and adding what compost they had. It was hard work. The Wyoming earth didn't give itself up easily, but working together, they cleared a plot large enough to matter. Why is this important to you? Caleb asked one evening as they finished for the day, both sweaty and mud-streaked, despite the lingering cold. Malin was quiet for a moment, looking at the turned earth. Because it's permanent, she said finally. A garden says I'm staying, that I'm building something here, not just passing through. She paused. And because I miss cooking with the things I grew up with. The flavors. It sounds small, maybe. It doesn't sound small. She looked at him. Nothing that connects a person to where they came from sounds small, he said. Bring as many of your old things into this new life as you want. That's how it works. That's how you build something that's actually yours instead of just somewhere you're surviving. Malin held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then she looked back at the garden plot. I'll start the seeds next week, she said. And the letter from Victor Crane arrived on a Tuesday. It was addressed to Caleb personally, not through lawyers, and it was short. Caleb read it twice. Then he handed it to Malin without comment. The letter said, Mr. Merritt, you seem like a reasonable man. I'm writing to make you a reasonable offer. Drop your defense, return the woman. My employer will waive all financial claims against you. You walk away with your ranch, your reputation, and your freedom. Continue this fight, and I promise you will lose everything. The choice is yours. Malin read it. Her face grew paler with each line. When she finished, she looked at Caleb. You should take it, she said. Her voice was flat. This is your way out. Give me up. Save yourself. No, Caleb said. Caleb, no. He took the letter back from her hands, carried it to the fireplace, and dropped it in. They both watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening and becoming nothing. I don't break my word, he said. I said you were my wife. I meant it. I said I'd protect you. I will. Whatever it costs. Even your ranch. Even that. Malin stared at him. He could see the internal argument playing across her face, logic versus something she wasn't yet willing to name. Why, she asked finally. It was becoming, Caleb realized, the question between them. The one neither of them had fully answered. Because you're not someone I barely know anymore, he said. The truth came out before he could stop it. You're my partner. You're the person I have coffee with every morning. You work beside me every day. You've made this cabin feel like something other than a place I'm just existing in. He stopped, then more quietly. So no, Malin, I'm not giving you up. Not for money, not for threats, not for anything. The silence after that was long and full of something neither of them was ready to look at directly. All right, Malin said at last. Her voice was barely a whisper. Then we fight. Together. Together, Caleb agreed. Meh. That night, lying in his narrow space on his side of the partition, Caleb acknowledged what he'd been avoiding for weeks. This had stopped being about obligations somewhere along the way. It had stopped being about doing the right thing, about second chances, about principle. It had become something else, something that had to do with the way Malin hummed quietly while working in the kitchen, and the way she laughed at herself when she made a mistake, and then immediately corrected it, in the way she looked at the prairie in the early morning, like she was seeing something she'd been searching for her whole life. He cared about her. Deeply specifically in a way that had nothing to do with marriage certificates or legal obligations. That terrified him more than any court hearing. I understand. The hearing date drew closer. With it came more letters, some supportive from people they'd reached out to, others hostile. Word had spread about the case and people had opinions. Some praised Caleb for standing up against what was clearly trafficking. Others condemned him for marrying outside his race, for harboring trouble, for disrupting the proper order of things. Caleb burned the hostile letters without reading them past the first few lines. But 2 weeks before the hearing, Mary Chen came with news that changed the picture. She came on horseback, riding hard, and didn't stop to tie her horse properly at the rail. Just looped the reins loosely and came straight to the cabin door. I found Showa, she said. Malin's hand flew to her mouth. She's alive, Mary said quickly. She got away too, 2 days after Malin. She's in Cheyenne right now with a family who's been sheltering her. She's willing to testify. The silence that followed was the kind that contains too much to speak all at once. She got away, Malin said finally. Her voice cracked on the last word. She got away, Mary confirmed, and she remembers everything. The wagon, the men, the room in Denver, The names, she paused. She also remembers the name of the man who owns the operation. Not Crane, not Voss. Someone above both of them, a man with enough money and influence to have kept this running for years. Caleb straightened. Who? Mary named a name. Caleb didn't recognize it, but he could see from Maylyn's expression that she did, that the name meant something, that it connected to something in the long chain of men who had passed ownership of her between them, like she was inventory. If we can get Shu's testimony to the judge, Mary said, along with everything Maylyn has written down, along with the documentation you've gathered, this stops being just a contract dispute. This becomes an investigation into a trafficking operation. And suddenly, it's not just Maylyn fighting Voss. It's the territory of Wyoming looking at the people behind Voss. They'll try to discredit her, Caleb said. Same as they'll try with Maylyn, two Chinese women claiming trafficking. Which is why we need corroboration, Mary said. And I've been making inquiries. There are 3 other women in Denver and Salt Lake and Laramie who were in similar situations. None of them willing to testify yet, but all of them willing to write letters. Anonymous if they have to be, but in writing. She looked at Caleb directly. This case has gotten bigger than a marriage dispute, Mr. Merritt. You need to understand that. If you go to Cheyenne and win, you're not just protecting Maylyn. You're potentially bringing down something that has been operating for a long time. And if we lose, then they move Shu and the others before anyone can reach them, and it disappears again. Mary's voice was even. So we don't lose. After she left the cabin, was quiet for a long time. Did you know, Caleb asked finally, about the scale of it? Not the names, not the structure. Maylyn was sitting very still looking at her hands. But I knew there were others. In Denver, in the room next to mine, there was always someone else. Always someone new arriving and someone else being sent somewhere. She paused. I thought about trying to help them, but I couldn't even help myself. You helped yourself, Caleb said firmly. You survived, you got out, and now you have the chance to make sure what happened to you can't keep happening to others. Maylyn looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not just the determination he'd come to expect from her, but something that burned underneath it. Something that had been waiting for an opportunity to become action. Then let's make sure we win, she said. They prepared for the journey to Cheyenne with the careful thoroughness of people who understood that they would only get one chance to get this right. Maylyn wrote and rewrote her testimony until every date was exact, every name correctly spelled, every detail anchored to a specific memory she could defend under questioning. Caleb wrote his own account of everything from the morning Maylyn appeared at his gate to the moment Crane had ridden into Red Hollow to the letter that had burned in his fireplace. On the morning they left, Caleb found Maylyn on the porch in the gray pre-dawn, wearing her pink dress. She was looking out at the ranch, the corral, the garden plot they'd prepared together, the horizon that was just beginning to lighten. Why that dress? He asked, coming to stand beside her. Because I started this in it, she said. I'll face whatever comes next in it too. They rode out as the sun came up, 2 horses moving east through a spring morning that smelled of mud and new grass and something that might have been possibility. Neither of them said much. There was nothing left to plan. Everything had been prepared, every piece of evidence gathered, every testimony arranged. What remained was to go to Cheyenne and stand up in a courtroom and tell the truth and trust that it would be enough. Caleb wasn't certain it would be. He had seen truth lose before. He had seen money and influence win over evidence. He had seen courts decide that some people's testimony counted for less than others simply because of who they were. But he had also seen what happened when someone who had been told their voice didn't matter refused to believe it. He had watched Maylyn do that every single day since she'd appeared at his gate quietly, persistently, without drama, just by waking up and working and building and refusing to disappear. She wasn't going to disappear now, not if he had anything to say about it. They reached the edge of the property as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the prairie in long, slanting gold. Caleb looked back once at the cabin at the garden plot, waiting for seeds at the corral, where the horses moved through the early morning in their unhurried way. He thought about what it would mean to lose this. The land, the life, everything he'd built here. He'd promised Maylyn it was worth the risk, and he'd meant it. But standing here at the edge of it, looking at the only thing he'd made from nothing that had ever truly felt like his, he felt the weight of that promise in a way that was harder to carry than he'd expected. Then Maylyn pulled her horse up beside him and looked at him steadily, and the weight shifted. Worth it, he thought. Whatever happens, worth every bit of it. Man, The road to Cheyenne was 3 days of hard riding through spring mud that pulled at the horses' hooves with every step. They made camp each night beside whatever shelter they could find, a stand of cottonwoods, a dry creek bed, once in the ruins of a homestead whose owners had long since given up on whatever dream had brought them here. The second night out, camped beside a creek running high with snowmelt. Malin sat close to the fire and spoke about her first husband in a way she hadn't before. His name was Chen Wei, she said. We met when I was 17. He was older, 32, and very serious. The kind of man who made lists and kept them. She smiled, quiet and private. He kept a list of everything I liked. Things I said I wanted to eat, places I mentioned wanting to visit, books I was curious about. He never made a big gesture of it. He would just quietly arrange for those things to be available. Caleb was tending the fire, adding a piece of branch without making a production of it. He sounds like a good man. He was. Not exciting the way stories make men exciting, but kind, consistent. I never had to wonder what he thought of me. She paused. When he died, the worst part wasn't the grief. It was realizing I'd built my sense of safety entirely inside someone else's existence. And when that existence ended, I didn't know how to be safe on my own. You learned, Caleb said. Not fast enough. She watched the fire. The men who took the shop, they knew that. They knew I was still learning, still figuring out how to exist without Wei beside me. They moved before I could find my footing. That's what predators do, Caleb said. They find the moment when someone's not ready and they move fast. It's not a reflection of who you are, it's a reflection of who they are. Malin looked at him. Is that what happened to you in Philadelphia? Different kind of predator, Caleb said. My father was very good at finding the moment when I wasn't ready and offering a version of events where everything was already decided and my role was just to comply. He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't violent. He wasn't cruel in the obvious way, but he was very good at making you feel like resistance was both futile and foolish, like your own desires were a kind of embarrassment. And your mother, she agreed with him, or at least she deferred to him so completely that it amounted to the same thing. Caleb looked at the fire. There was a woman he wanted me to marry, the daughter of a business associate. She was perfectly pleasant. I didn't dislike her. But marrying her would have meant becoming my father, running his bank, living his life, and he paused. I couldn't. So you left. I left. In the middle of the night with what I could carry. Took a train west and kept going until the train stopped, and then I walked. He shook his head, and something in his expression was almost wry. I was 24 and completely unprepared for any of this. First winter nearly killed me 3 separate times. But you stayed. I stayed. He looked around at the prairie, at the dark sky, bristling with stars above them. Because for the first time in my life, every decision I made was actually mine. Even the bad ones, even the ones that nearly killed me. They were mine. Malin was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled between them. That's what I want, she said. Not necessarily the nearly killing me part, but the rest of it. The rest of it is good, Caleb said. She smiled at that, not the careful, controlled smile she deployed when she was managing how she appeared, but something smaller and more genuine. Tell me something about your life before, she said. Before the ranch. Something good. Caleb thought about it. My grandfather's library, he said. He had 3,000 books, floor to ceiling every room. He was a quiet man who had somehow managed to opt out of the entire competitive ambition of my father's world, and he spent his days reading and thinking and making notes in the margins of things. Caleb paused. He's the one who gave me the idea that you could choose a different kind of life. He never said it directly, but I watched him and understood that if one person in that family had refused to be what they were supposed to be, another person might be able to refuse as well. Is he still alive? He was when I left. He'd be nearly 80 now. Caleb looked up at the stars. I've thought about writing to him, but I was afraid his mail was monitored, afraid any contact would let my father trace me. Write to him, Malin said quietly. After this is over, whatever happens in Cheyenne, write to him. Caleb looked at her. He sounds like someone who deserves to know you're all right, she said. And you sound like someone who needs to know he is. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. They reached Cheyenne on the afternoon of the third day, and the city pressed in around them, people everywhere, buildings crowded together, the constant noise and smoke of a place that had grown faster than it was designed to. Caleb watched Malin's shoulders tighten as they rode down the main street, watched her eyes track the stares of people who stopped and looked at the Chinese woman in the carefully mended pink dress riding beside the weathered rancher. He had grown so accustomed to her presence beside him that it required a conscious effort now to imagine what she looked like to someone who didn't know her. He made himself do it, tried to see her through a stranger's eyes. What he saw was a woman holding herself perfectly upright, on horseback chin, level expression, composed, meeting every stare with a steadiness that gave nothing away. Not defiant, not diminished, simply present, unashamed, exactly as much herself as she always was. He found he couldn't imagine her any other way. They found a boarding house on the edge of town, run by a widow who looked them over with sharp eyes, but asked no questions beyond their names and how long they'd be staying. Separate rooms, Caleb said. Married, Malin added quietly, but my husband is respectful of propriety. The widow's expression softened slightly. Second floor, rooms 12 and 13, connecting door between them. Breakfast at 6, no exceptions. The rooms were small but clean. Caleb unlocked the connecting door between them and left both sides open. He saw Malin relax slightly when she saw that, knowing she wasn't isolated, that the thin wall between them was permeable. Get some rest, Caleb told her. Tomorrow's going to be long. But neither of them rested well. Caleb lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, the irregular percussion of a place that never quite went silent. Through the open connecting door, he heard Malin pacing in her room, her footsteps quiet but restless on the wooden floor. Finally, well past midnight, he got up and knocked softly on the doorframe. She turned from the window. She'd changed into her simple ranch clothes, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. Can't sleep either, he asked. I keep thinking about what they'll say tomorrow, she said. About what their lawyers will make me sound like. She paused. I keep imagining in their version of events and finding places where it almost sounds true, where I can see how someone who doesn't know me might believe it. Caleb entered her room and stood beside her at the window. Below, Cheyenne offered its uneven nighttime light saloons still burning, the blue dark between them, punctuated by the orange of gas lamps. Let them say whatever they want, he said. We have the truth and we have evidence. That has to count for something. Does it? Malin's voice was barely a whisper. The truth didn't help me in San Francisco when those men took the shop. It didn't help in Denver when I was locked in that room. Why would it help now? Because you're not alone this time, Caleb said. Because you have people willing to stand up and testify for you. Because we've built a record they can't just dismiss. He paused. The law isn't perfect, but it's not completely broken. And Judge Harrison is still one person. Malin looked at him. Who might decide that two Chinese women making accusations against men with money and lawyers is less credible than... Then we make it impossible to dismiss, Caleb said. We're not walking in there with just testimony. We're walking in with Mrs. Wong's letter and Shu's deposition and every piece of documentation Mary helped us gather. We're walking in with a case. He met her eyes. I know you've been let down by systems that should have protected you. I know why you don't trust this. But I need you to trust me. I've been preparing for this since the day the lawsuit arrived. I won't let them take you. Malin looked at him for a long time in the dim light from the window. I know, she said finally. That's the strange thing. In spite of everything that's happened to me, in spite of every reason I have not to trust anyone, I do trust you. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. Where does that come from, she asked, and he understood that she was genuinely asking. Not rhetorical. Not a compliment, a real question from someone who had learned to interrogate her own responses carefully. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm glad of it. They stood like that at the window, their hands clasped, looking out at the sleeping city. Eventually, Caleb felt Malin's trembling subside, her breathing slow and deepen. He guided her gently to the bed and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and she led him, which he understood was its own kind of statement from someone who had learned not to let people do things for her. Try to sleep, he said. I'll be right next door. Caleb, she said as he turned to leave. He stopped. I know this marriage was supposed to be just protection, just paper. She paused. But you've become more to me than that. You've become someone, she searched for the word, someone I'm glad to know, someone I depend on in a way I didn't plan for. Caleb felt his chest tighten with something he wasn't going to name. Not tonight, not before the hearing. You've become important to me too, he said quietly. More than I expected. More than I probably should admit. He left before either of them could say more, returning to his own room and lying in the dark with the connecting door standing open between them, letting him hear her breathing slowly even out into sleep. The small gap felt like an acknowledgement, not a declaration, just a fact they were both aware of, and neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud yet. The territorial courthouse was a building designed to remind people that the law was serious business. Stone and dark wood and high ceilings that swallowed sound and returned it as an echo. Tall windows that let in light but not warmth. Wooden benches hard enough to discourage comfort. Everything about the architecture said this is not a place for sentiment. Caleb and Maylin arrived early, walking through the heavy front doors with Mary Chen beside them. They found their seats on the benches reserved for defendants and waited while the room filled with the sounds of a legal proceeding, assembling itself, lawyers shuffling papers, clerks speaking in low voices, the constant bureaucratic percussion of justice being administered. Crane arrived with two lawyers. Both were dressed in expensive Eastern suits that made Caleb acutely aware of his own frontier clothes. The lawyers carried thick leather portfolios and moved with the relaxed confidence of men who had won before and expected to win again. They sat up at the plaintiff's table without looking at Caleb or Maylin. Caleb and Maylin had no lawyer. They had prepared their own defense, compiled their own evidence, prepared their own testimony. Mary had warned them it was risky. Courts favored those who could afford professional representation, but they'd had no choice. Every dollar they could spare had gone toward gathering evidence and arranging for witnesses to travel to Cheyenne. What they had was the truth. They had decided to trust that it would be enough. Judge Harrison entered at 9 o'clock exactly, and everyone rose. He was a man in his 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of human dishonesty. He settled into his chair and surveyed the courtroom without expression. "This is the matter of Voss versus Merritt," he said, his voice carrying easily in the silent room. "The plaintiff alleges breach of contract and fraudulent marriage. The defendants deny these claims. I've reviewed the initial filings from both sides." He paused, looking from Crane's lawyers to Caleb with the flat attention of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by anyone. "Opening statements, plaintiff first." One of Crane's lawyers stood, a tall man with a Boston accent and the practiced ease of someone who had built a career out of sounding more reasonable than anyone with his interests had any right to be. He launched into a polished presentation that Caleb had anticipated and still found nearly suffocating in its skilled dishonesty. The story as the lawyer told it: Maylin was an ungrateful woman who had violated a legitimate employment contract, then engineered a sham marriage to evade her legal obligations. She had taken advantage of an isolated rancher who didn't know better. She had cost his client, a legitimate businessman, providing employment opportunities to vulnerable immigrants, significant financial loss. The lawyer presented documents. A contract with Maylin's name on it, a signature that Caleb had seen Maylin look at with controlled fury, because the shape of the letters was close, but not quite right. Testimony from the restaurant owner. Financial records showing money spent on her transportation and housing. Everything arranged to make exploitation look like investment. When he finished and sat down looking satisfied, Caleb felt Maylin's hand find his under the table. Her fingers were cold. She squeezed once hard and he squeezed back. "Mr. Merritt," Judge Harrison said, looking directly at Caleb, "you're representing yourself and your wife in this matter. Do you wish to make an opening statement?" Caleb stood. He had prepared remarks, had written them out and revised them and read them aloud to Maylin in their boarding house room the previous night. But standing here now, looking at the judge and the crowded benches and the two lawyers at the plaintiff's table who were watching him with the polite condescension of people who expected to dismantle whatever he said next, he set the prepared remarks aside. "Your Honor," he said, "everything you just heard was a lie wrapped in legitimate-sounding language." He heard the murmur that went through the room. "That contract they showed you, it was signed under duress by a woman who had no other options. The employment they described was forced labor with conditions that amounted to imprisonment. And this marriage they're calling fraudulent." He paused. "It's the realest thing I've done in 12 years. He saw the judge's eyebrow rise slightly and pressed on. "Maylin came to my ranch because she was running for her life from men who treated her like property. I married her because it was the right thing to do and because she deserved better than what she'd been given. If that makes me a fool in the eyes of this court, so be it. But it doesn't make the marriage fraudulent, and it doesn't give these men the right to take her back to a life of exploitation." He sat down. His heart was pounding, though he kept his face calm. Under the table, Maylin's hand was still in his. The next 2 hours were brutal. Crane's lawyers called witness after witness. The restaurant owner who claimed Mei Lin had been a willing employee. The wagon driver who said she had seemed content until the moment she ran. Even a doctor who testified that when he had examined Mei Lin in Denver, she had shown no signs of physical abuse or mistreatment. Each testimony felt like a nail being driven in. Caleb cross-examined as best he could, pointing out inconsistencies, pressing on the implausibility of certain claims, noting that seemed content was not the same as was free. But he wasn't a lawyer, and the witnesses had been well coached. They didn't break easily. When their turn came, Caleb called Mary Chen first. Mary took the oath with the calm dignity of someone who had been deciding to be dignified in hostile rooms for a long time. Caleb led her through a careful account of trafficking patterns in the territory, women disappearing into employment operations, the use of fraudulent contracts and manufactured debt to trap people in servitude, the specific language of documents designed to look legitimate while creating conditions of impossibility. In your professional opinion, Caleb asked, does the contract presented by the plaintiff match the patterns you've observed in these operations? Yes, Mary said without hesitation. The language is almost identical to contracts I've seen in at least 4 other cases. They're designed to look like legitimate employment agreements while ensuring that the person signing them can never fulfill the conditions. The debt always grows faster than it can be repaid. The charges are always invented. The goal is not payment, it's permanent control. Crane's lawyers objected. Judge Harrison allowed the testimony, but instructed Mary to focus on facts rather than patterns. Next, Caleb called Mrs. Wong, who had traveled from San Francisco specifically to testify. The older woman spoke quietly but precisely about Mei Lin's life before, about Chen Wei, about their shop, about the community's knowledge that what happened after his death was predatory and illegal, about the men who had moved in while Mei Lin was still in the rawness of new grief and taken what wasn't theirs to take. She was a good wife, a good businesswoman, Mrs. Wong said firmly. What happened to her after her husband died was criminal. Everyone in our community knew it, but we were powerless to stop it. Crane's lawyers attacked her credibility. Mrs. Wong answered every question with the steady precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this. Then Caleb presented Shu's deposition taken in writing because Shu was too frightened to appear in person, but notarized and witnessed. Shu's account of the room in Denver, of the conditions of the men who came and went and treated women like items on an inventory list, of the transportation to Red Hollow, and the things both she and Mei Lin had been told awaited them there. And then Mei Lin took the stand. She walked to the witness chair with her chin up in her pink dress, her hair braided. She looked like someone who had decided that if this was the moment everything would be decided, she intended to be entirely present for it. Caleb led her through her testimony carefully, from San Francisco, through the loss of the shop, through Denver, through the room on the 3rd floor, through the night of the broken wagon wheel, and everything since. Mei Lin's voice remained steady throughout. She was telling the truth, and the truth required no performance. Then Crane's lead lawyer stood for cross-examination. He was good. Caleb had known he would be. He approached Mei Lin with a patronizing courtesy that was its own kind of contempt, and he went at her from every angle, implying that she had signed the contract freely, that her escape from the wagon had been suspiciously easy, that her appearance at Caleb's gate had been a calculated manipulation rather than a desperate act of survival. You claim you were in prison, the lawyer said, yet you were able to escape rather easily when the opportunity arose. Doesn't that suggest the security was less strict than you're implying? No, Mei Lin said steadily. It suggests I was desperate enough to take a dangerous chance. They didn't expect me to run in the middle of nowhere in freezing cold, wearing nothing but a silk dress. Most women wouldn't have survived. I barely did. And when you arrived at Mr. Merritt's ranch, you immediately proposed marriage. Rather convenient, wouldn't you say? I proposed marriage or death, Mei Lin said. Those were the only options I could see. I didn't know Mr. Merritt would choose a 3rd option to help me without conditions, to give me time to heal before making any decision. That was his character, not my manipulation. The lawyer pressed on for a long time. He tried several more angles. He implied isolation, vulnerability, exploitation in the other direction, that Caleb was a lonely man who had been trapped by a desperate woman. He implied that Mei Lin had constructed her story carefully over months, that every detail was designed to be unfalsifiable. Mei Lin answered every question with the same steady honesty. She didn't perform outrage. She didn't perform distress. She told the truth and let it stand. When the lawyer finally dismissed her, frustrated and slightly off balance, she walked back to her seat with her head still high. You did well, Caleb said under his breath. I told the truth, Malin said simply. That's all I can do. No. Caleb took the stand next. Crane's lawyer went at him from the start. You'd never met her before. You married her within days of meeting. You admit there was no love, no genuine relationship at the time of the marriage. I said there was no romantic love when we married, Caleb interrupted. There's a difference. What there was recognition. I recognized someone who needed help and who deserved better than what the world had given her. I acted on that recognition. And since then, the lawyer pressed, you've had months living with this woman. Are you claiming feelings have developed? Yes, Caleb said simply. He didn't look at Malin. I'm claiming that. Convenient timing, the lawyer said in the same tone he'd used with Malin right before the hearing. It happened gradually, Caleb said, over months, through dozens of small moments, through learning to trust each other, through choosing every day to build something together instead of just coexisting. He paused. If you've never experienced that kind of slowly growing connection, I'm sorry for you. But its gradual nature doesn't make it less real. The lawyer tried other angles, pressed on Caleb's 12 years of isolation, his lack of family connections, his apparent willingness to risk everything for someone he'd known only a few months, trying to paint him as either manipulated or manipulating. Caleb answered every question honestly and let the truth stand in the same way he'd watched Malin do. When he finally stepped down exhausted, he felt Malin's hand slip into his again. Judge Harrison called a recess. Everyone filed out into the harsh spring sunlight. You did well, Mary said, joining them on the courthouse steps. Both of you. You told the truth clearly. That's all you could do. Will it be enough? Malin asked. Mary hesitated for just a moment. I don't know, but I think the evidence we presented makes it very difficult for Harrison to rule in their favor without ignoring testimony from 4 separate witnesses in a documented pattern of trafficking activity. They waited through the afternoon. The sun moved across the sky and shadows lengthened, and eventually the bailiff came to tell them that the judge was ready to issue his ruling. The courtroom felt smaller when they walked back in. Caleb noticed that some people had left the casually curious ones, the ones who'd come for entertainment. What remained were the people who actually cared about the outcome arranged on either side of the room, like the architecture of a decision about to be made. Caleb and Malin sat down together. He became aware somewhere in the back of his mind that this was the last moment before whatever came next. That in a few minutes, everything would be different in some direction. That Malin's hand in his was either the last few minutes of something or the first few minutes of something else. He held on. Judge Harrison entered. Everyone rose. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this case. He began, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent decades being the person in the room whose words could not be taken back. This is a complex matter that touches on contract law, immigration, marriage legitimacy, and human rights. I've considered the arguments from both sides carefully. A pause. The contract presented by the plaintiff appears valid on its face. Caleb felt Malin's hand tighten. However, Harrison continued, the circumstances under which it was signed raised serious questions. Multiple witnesses testified to patterns of coercion and exploitation that call into question whether Mrs. Merritt, then Miss Lynn, signed in this contract freely or under duress. Furthermore, the conditions described in testimony suggest that regardless of the contract's initial validity, the subsequent treatment of Mrs. Merritt constituted unlawful imprisonment and trafficking. Caleb's chest began to ease. No contract, the judge said, regardless of how legitimate it appears on its face, can be used to justify such treatment. He looked up directly at Crane and his lawyers. As for the marriage, the plaintiff argues it's fraudulent, entered into solely to evade legal obligations. The defendants argue it began as protection, but became genuine. A pause. Having observed both Mr. and Mrs. Merritt testify, having seen the way they interact and speak about each other, I find their account considerably more credible than the plaintiff's accusations. He looked now at Caleb and Malin. Marriage is a legal contract, yes, but it is also a commitment between two people. Sometimes that commitment grows from love, sometimes from necessity, and sometimes, as appears to be the case here, from both. The law recognizes all of these as valid foundations for marriage. He picked up his gavel. Therefore, I rule as follows. The marriage between Caleb Merritt and Malin Merritt is legitimate and legally binding. The contract presented by the plaintiff is void due to evidence of coercion and unlawful conditions. Mrs. Merritt is under no obligation to return to the plaintiff's employer or to provide compensation. Furthermore, I am directing the territorial marshal to investigate the plaintiff's employer for potential violations of anti-trafficking statutes. The gavel came down. The sound of it filled the room like a door opening. The courtroom erupted. Caleb heard Crane's lawyer shouting objections, heard Mary Chen's triumphant exhale, heard the murmur of the crowd processing what had just happened. But all of it felt distant and muffled because Mei Lin had turned to him with tears streaming down her face, and she was smiling the way the prairie looked after rain, like something that had been waiting a long time to open up. "We won," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. "We actually won." Caleb pulled her into his arms, and she held on with both hands, her face against his chest, her whole body shaking with the release of months of terror and preparation and refusing to give up. He held her carefully the way you hold something that has survived a great deal and deserves to be handled with awareness of what it cost. "Yes," he said, "we did." Crane and his lawyers left within an hour of the verdict. Their threats of appeal seemed to evaporate in the face of the judge's direction to investigate their employer. Caleb suspected they had realized that pursuing the case further would only draw more scrutiny to an operation they preferred stayed hidden. That evening, Mary insisted on taking them to dinner at a small restaurant run by a Chinese family. She knew a bright, crowded, warm place that smelled of things Caleb couldn't identify, and that made Maylin's whole face change the moment she walked through the door. She spoke rapid Chinese with the restaurant owner's wife and helped serve tea to other tables, falling naturally into the rhythm of the place. Her laugh when it came was different here, fuller, less guarded, belonging to someone who was surrounded by things that knew her history without requiring it to be explained. Caleb sat back and watched, and Mary settled into the chair beside him. "She needs this," Mary said quietly. "Not just the ranch, not just you. Connection to her own community. People who share her language and her history." "I know," Caleb said. And he did know. He had seen it the moment they walked in, and Maylin had relaxed in a particular way he'd never seen before. "I've been thinking about that. Regular trips to Red Hollow. Opportunities to visit with the families in the area. There are 3 Chinese families within a day's ride of your ranch," Mary said. "Scattered, but there. She should know she's not alone out there." "She won't be," Caleb said. "I'll make sure of it." Mary studied his face for a moment. "You love her?" "Not a question," Caleb answered anyway. "Yes." "Does she know?" "Almost. We were close to saying it before the verdict. We kept it in because—" He paused. "Because I wanted her to hear it when we weren't in the middle of fighting for our lives. When it could just be what it is." Mary smiled, a genuine warm thing that made her look younger. "Tell her soon. Don't make her wait for it." Caleb looked across at the restaurant to where Maylin was laughing at something the restaurant owner's wife had said, her pink dress bright against the warm lit room. "I won't," he said. "Servan." They rode out of Cheyenne at dawn the next morning, leaving the city's noise behind them with something close to relief. The prairie opened up in all directions, vast and clean, and full of the particular silence that comes after a decision has been made. Maylin rode quietly for several miles. Then she pulled her horse alongside Caleb's and said with the directness that was so characteristically hers, "Mary says you love me." Caleb glanced at her. "Mary talks too much." "Is it true?" A pause. The horses moved through the spring morning. "Yes," he said. Maylin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know this marriage was supposed to be practical. Paper and protection. Nothing more." "I know. At some point it stopped at being that." "I know when," Caleb said. "It was the day you stood in that courtroom and told the truth about everything that happened to you, and you didn't perform it. You just said it plainly and let it be what it was, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought that was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. And I thought I wanted to see you do brave things for the rest of my life." Maylin looked at him. In the morning light, her expression was clear and unguarded in a way he had only seen a few times before, and each time it had undone him slightly. "I love you too," she said, simply. "I didn't plan for it, but there it is." They rode in silence for a while after that, but a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after something important has been said and acknowledged and allowed to exist. Eventually, the ranch appeared on the horizon, and Caleb felt something unlock in his chest. Home, actually home in a way it hadn't been before, or hadn't been in a long time. He looked over at Maylin riding beside him, with her pink dress and her straight back, and her eyes already looking toward the place they were going. There it was. All of it. They arrived home in the late afternoon. Tom Wilson, a neighbor from 8 miles south who had been watching the place in their absence, was sitting on the porch steps with a coffee and the particular expression of a man who has been alone long enough to genuinely appreciate company. Heard the news from a writer yesterday, he said, getting to his feet when they reined in. He spoke to both of them, which Caleb noticed and appreciated. Congratulations on your victory. Thank you for watching the place, Caleb said. Tom waved this off. Then he addressed Maylin, directly looking at her with the careful respect of someone who had thought about this moment before it arrived and decided how he wanted to conduct himself. Mrs. Merritt, he said, I want you to know Red Hollow hasn't been what it ought to be toward you. Some of those people are going to keep being foolish about it for a while yet. But you've got friends out here whether they've made themselves known or not. I'm one of them. He paused. My mother was an immigrant in Oz, came here from Ireland with nothing and was treated like less than nothing until she proved she was more than any of them. I know something about watching that happen and having to choose which side of it you're on. Maylin looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard not to be moved and not entirely succeeding. Thank you, she said. That means more than you know. Tom gave a short nod, shook Caleb's hand, and rode south without another word. They unsaddled the horses together in the easy silence they had developed over months of doing things side by side. The animals were glad to be home. Caleb could feel it in the way they moved, the way the oldest mare pressed briefly against his hand before going to the water trough. The garden will need attention, Maylin said, looking toward the plot they'd prepared. Tomorrow, Caleb said, tonight you rest. She gave him the look that meant she was deciding whether to argue, then thought better of it. They ate a simple dinner, beans from the last of the stored supplies. Bread she mixed and baked, while Caleb checked on the animals one more time. The cabin was warm and smelled like home in a way that hit Caleb differently now, as if the weeks in Cheyenne had made him able to perceive it fresh. After dinner, Maylin sat at the table with her hands around a cup of tea and looked out the small window at the darkening prairie. What happens now, she asked. We go back to our lives, Caleb said. But what does that look like? She met his eyes. We're married for real now, not just on paper. The partition in the bedroom came down while we were gone, Caleb said. I had Tom put it in the woodpile. Maylin looked at him. I was presumptuous, and he said, if you want it back. I don't want it back, she said quickly. A pause. The fire crackled. We move slowly, he said. We don't rush anything. You tell me what you need, and I try to give it. We build this the way we've built everything else, a little at a time, paying attention, not forcing it to be more than it is before it's ready. Maylin looked at him for a long moment. That's exactly what I needed to hear, she said. That first night back, they lay in the same bed without the partition between them, and it was different from the careful arrangement of before, not dramatically, but the way mornings are different from afternoons, even when the weather hasn't changed. Maylin slept with her back toward him, and he lay listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening, and it was enough. In the weeks that followed, spring came fully to the Wyoming prairie. The garden Maylin planted began to sprout neat rows of green, pushing up through the dark soil she had worked so carefully. She tended it every morning and evening, kneeling between the rows with her hands in the earth, and Caleb often found her there with an expression on her face that was close to what peace looked like. One morning he came to call her for breakfast and found her in the garden, staring at a cluster of broadleaf plants near the center of the plot, tears running quietly down her face. What's wrong? He asked, immediately worried. The bok choy is growing, she said. She looked up at him and she was smiling through the tears. I wasn't sure it would survive here. The climate is so different from what it needs. But it grew. Caleb looked at the plants, ordinary enough in his eyes, but clearly something else entirely in hers. It means I can make things grow here, she said. That I can bring pieces of my old life into this new one. That this place can be home, truly home, not just somewhere I'm surviving. Caleb knelt beside her in the dirt. You've been making things grow since the day you got here, he said. The garden is just the part you planted on purpose. Maylin turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw something that stopped him love. Clear and open, and without the careful management that had been there in the early months. Not tentative anymore, simply present. He leaned forward and kissed her there in the dirt between the garden rows, with the morning light coming slanted across the prairie and the horses moving in the corral and everything in its right place. When they pulled back, she was still smiling. I want to stay, she said, not checking, not asking permission, stating a fact she had decided. Good, Caleb said. I want to plant more things next year. I want to learn to track deer properly, and I want to actually understand how you know what the weather is going to do 2 days out. She stopped herself, laughing softly at her own list. I want a lot of things. Then we'll do them, he said. All of them, however long it takes. She took his hand, both of them still kneeling in the dirt beside the bok choy that had survived a Wyoming winter against the odds, and Caleb thought, this is what winning looks like. Not the gavel in Cheyenne, not the papers that confirmed their marriage was real. This, right here, two people with their hands in the earth making plans. One afternoon in late May, exactly a year and some weeks after Maylin had appeared at his gate in the early morning dark, Caleb came back from checking the fence line to find her standing at the spot where they had first met. She was wearing the pink dress. Remembering? He asked, coming up beside her. Comparing, she said. I wanted to stand here and see how different it felt. Does it? Maylin turned to look at him. The sun was low and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon and late spring, and she looked not like the woman who had arrived desperate and ready to die, but not entirely different from her either. Something essential was the same. What had changed was what surrounded it. Everything feels different, she said. And somehow I feel more like myself than I did then. More like the person I was trying to become when I was running. Caleb looked at her. Who were you trying to become? Someone who got to choose, she said. Someone whose life was her own. She paused. I think I'm there. I think I've been there for a while, but I wasn't sure until right now. He took her hand. Thank you, she said, for not choosing either of the options I gave you. For finding a third way when I couldn't see it. Thank you, he said, for trusting that I might. They stood at the gate as the sun moved lower, and the prairie turned gold and pink around them, the same colors as her dress, the same colors as the Wyoming sky, and the ranch was quiet and full and entirely completely theirs. But summer arrived and brought with it the particular intensity that the Wyoming prairie reserved for the months when winter was far enough away to be almost forgotten. The days were long and hot, and the work expanded to fill them. Caleb and Maylin fell into a rhythm that had the quality of something that had been practiced rather than arranged the way partners in any kind of long endeavor eventually stopped negotiating every step and simply moved together. She had an instinct for the business of the ranch that surprised him still. One afternoon, with 2 horses ready to sell and a trip to the railway town 2 days east on the schedule, she asked to come along and handle the negotiation. I know how to read what people want, she said simply. Caleb let her. At the railway town, she negotiated with a patience and attentiveness that left the buyer visibly pleased and Caleb quietly astonished. She found the price where both sides felt they had done well, which meant she had found the actual value of what was being exchanged rather than simply the highest number she could extract. They rode home with nearly twice what Caleb had expected. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. Way and I ran a shop for 2 years, she said. Commerce is just people. If you pay attention to what people actually want, which is usually different from what they say they want, you can usually find a way to give it to them. What did that buyer actually want? He wanted to feel clever, she said. So I let him feel clever. He got a good price, genuinely good. He just thought he'd gotten a great one. She paused. Everyone wins. Caleb shook his head slowly. You're full of surprises. I hope so, she said. A marriage would be very dull if you knew everything about each other immediately. He looked over at her, and she was smiling that particular private smile that had become over months one of the most familiar things in his daily life. What else don't I know about you? He asked. Many things, she said. You'll learn them eventually. I'm not going anywhere. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the prairie spreading out in every direction. And Caleb thought about what she'd said, that she wasn't going anywhere. How different it felt to hear it now than it would have felt 6 months ago. Not like a promise made under pressure, just like a fact stated plainly because it was true. In the evenings, they sat on the porch when the day's heat finally broke, and the sky did what Wyoming skies did in summer, lit up in colors that seemed to require more emotional range than normal human experience usually demanded. Maylin had taken to sketching these sunsets in a small notebook she'd acquired in Cheyenne, not well, but with genuine pleasure returning to them, the way she returned to the garden, as something that was specifically hers. Caleb read. He had ordered books from back east through Frank at the general store, or slowly rebuilding something he'd given up when he'd left Philadelphia and told himself he didn't need. He suspected that Maylin was responsible for this indirectly. She had a way of making you remember what you had decided you didn't need, and then making you realize you had been wrong. I think you should write to your grandfather, she said one evening, not looking up from her sketching. I've been thinking about it. Don't just think about it. Caleb looked at the sun for a moment. What if he doesn't want to hear from me? It's been 12 years. He might have, Maylin agreed. But he also might be an 80-year-old man who has been wondering for 12 years whether his grandson is alive. She set down her pencil. You told me he was the person who showed you that a different kind of life was possible. He deserves to know that you found it. Caleb was quiet. And you deserve to know how he is, she said. He wrote the letter that night. 3 pages to a man he hadn't spoken to in 12 years, beginning not with apology, but with what Mary had told Maylin, just tell the truth and let it stand. He told his grandfather about Wyoming, about the ranch, about the land, about a woman who had appeared at his gate before dawn and proposed marriage at gunpoint and turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to him, about the life he had built and the life he was building. He sealed the letter and sent it with Frank the next time he rode to Red Hollow. Then he let it go and tried not to think about whether it would find its way to the right hands or what it might set in motion. Mary Chen visited one evening in late July, riding out from Red Hollow with news about the investigation. The territorial marshal had been thorough. The operation behind Voss had begun to unravel, several men arrested in Denver, a number of women freed from conditions similar to what Maylin had described. She was in Cheyenne, Mary said. She's safe. She wanted me to tell you. Maylin received this quietly, sitting very still. And the others, she'd asked? The women who wrote letters. Some of them are coming forward now, Mary said. The arrests gave them cover they didn't have before. When it's just one person speaking against a powerful organization, it's easy to dismiss. When it's many people with documentation, she shook her head. It becomes something else. Good, Maylin said. After Mary left, the evening was quiet for a while. I want to find a way to help them, Maylin said at last. Caleb looked at her. The women who are still in the situations like mine was, she said. I don't know what form that takes, but I want to do something with what happened to me besides just survive it. What are you thinking? Something here, she said slowly. The ranch has space. We could offer shelter to women who need somewhere safe while they figure out what comes next. Not forever, just long enough. A place to rest and work and heal. She paused. The way you gave me. Caleb looked at her. Then he looked at the land around them, the garden, the corral, the prairie extending in every direction under the enormous summer sky. It would mean more people, he said, more work, more complications. Yes, Maylin agreed. It would mean this place is different than what it's been. It's already different, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what would we need to build? And Maylin smiled the smile of someone who has already been thinking about this for a long time and has been waiting for the question. I have some ideas, she said. The bunkhouse went up in September. Caleb built it himself with help from 2 men from Red Hollow, a carpenter named Ellis, who had come west from Massachusetts with a trade and a bad temper and had since mellowed into someone reliable, and Frank's eldest son, who wanted to learn construction and had the patience to be taught. Simple and solid, built from timber, hauled up from the valley, 1 large room with 4 beds, a small stove, windows on both sides for light. Maylin oversaw the interior. She was precise about what was needed: space for privacy, space for communal life, good light, a locking door that could be locked from the inside. She had thought about this carefully in the way she thought about most things, not from theory, but from her own body's memory of what safety and the absence of safety felt like. The lock is important, she told Ellis, who had proposed a simple latch. It needs to be a proper lock. Ellis glanced at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. Ellis put in a proper lock. The first woman arrived in October. Her name was Lynn. Mary Chen brought her out from Red Hollow in a borrowed wagon, and Lynn sat in the back of the wagon with her hands in her lap and a watchfulness about her that Caleb recognized the animal alertness of someone who had learned that stillness could be a form of invisibility. She was young, maybe 20. She had been in the Denver operation, freed when the arrest came through, and had nowhere to go and no one who knew where she was. She spoke English with a Cantonese accent and had a habit of looking at exits. Maylin welcomed her in Chinese, and something in Lynn's posture shifted almost immediately, the small, involuntary relaxation that comes when a person hears their own language in a foreign place. Caleb showed her the bunkhouse, explained that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, that there was work if she wanted it, that no one would require her to do anything she didn't want to do. The door locks from the inside, he said. Lynn looked at the lock for a moment. Then she looked at him. Thank you, she said. And the rhythm of the ranch changed with Lynn's arrival, and changed again when 2 more women came through. In November, both of them referred by the marshal's office in Cheyenne. The bunkhouse that had seemed large in September began to feel appropriately sized. Their names were Nian and Bao. Both older than Lynn. Nian was 30-something, Bao perhaps 40, Both had more English than Lynn and less obvious wariness, though Caleb learned to recognize that wariness expressed itself differently in different people. In Bao, it came out as extreme competence and constant useful activity. In Neon, it came out as precision and a reluctance to ask for anything. Maylin navigated all of this with a natural authority that Caleb found quietly remarkable. She didn't perform understanding. She had it, and it was evident in the way she moved through the daily life of the ranch, with these women teaching, without condescension, giving space without abandonment. She set up a small daily structure, morning animal care divided among everyone who was able afternoon work, that varied by season and need evenings that were unscheduled and belonged to whoever was in them. It was enough to give shape to the days without making demands that were too much. Lynn took to the animals immediately, and with an enthusiasm that seemed to surprise even her. By the second week, she was handling the horses on her own, and Caleb watched her with the mare that had carried Maylin to Red Hollow that first day, the way she talked quietly to the animal while she worked, the way she laughed when the mare nudged her with a nose. She could be good with horses, Caleb said to Maylin that evening. She's already good with horses, Maylin said. She's been good since her third day, you just noticed. Caleb considered this. Is that a comment on my observational skills? It's an observation, Maylin said and smiled. The days shortened toward winter. Maylin prepared the ranch for the cold with the systematic thoroughness she had developed in 2 winters of paying close attention to what Caleb knew and extending it with her own experience of scarcity and what it cost when you weren't ready. She organized the food stores with the precision of someone who had calculated margins before, who understood viscerally what it meant to run out of things. Bao, who had apparently run a household in Shanghai before everything changed, helped with this, and they worked together in the kitchen with the focused efficiency of 2 people who had both spent significant portions of their lives at feeding other people, whether they felt like it or not. The result was a kitchen that smelled frequently of things Caleb had never eaten before and found he liked considerably. His diet had been functional for 12 years, adequate, fuel-oriented, frequently boring. Now it was regularly interesting. You could eat these things before, Maylin pointed out when he said as much. Red Hollow has an establishment that serves Chinese food on Fridays. I didn't know that, because you only went to Red Hollow for supplies and immediately came home. I like home, Caleb said. Maylin smiled. Me too. Then, a letter arrived from Philadelphia in December. It was addressed to Caleb in the shaky hand of someone old, and when he opened it, he recognized the handwriting from the margins of 3,000 books. His grandfather was alive, 81 with bad eyesight and a hip that complained in cold weather, but alive and in possession of his full faculties, and the letter made clear, profoundly relieved to hear from him. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he brought it to Maylin. She read it and handed it back, and her expression was doing several things at once. He sounds like what you said he was, she said. He is, Caleb said. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket against his chest in the place where he kept things that mattered. He wants to meet you. Does he? He says, Caleb consulted the letter. Any woman who can make my grandson write a letter after 12 years of silence is either remarkable or alarming, and from what you describe, apparently both. I should like to meet her. Maylin laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from being genuinely surprised. I like him already, she said. I'll write back and suggest he come west in the spring, Caleb said, if he's able to travel. He paused. I know it's a long way for an 81-year-old man with a bad hip. He may not be able to manage it. Then we go to him, Maylin said simply. Caleb looked at her. Family matters, she said. You told me about him like he was someone important. He is important. Go see him. She paused. After the spring planting, I can manage the ranch for a few weeks. You'd be here alone. Not alone, she said, gesturing in the direction of the bunkhouse. Besides, she met his eyes. I need to be able to manage the ranch on my own. Not because you're going somewhere permanently, but because I need to know that I can. That this is mine as well as yours, that I'm a partner in it, not a dependent. Caleb was quiet for a moment, hearing what she was actually saying. You're already a partner in it, he said. Then let me act like one, she said. Go see your grandfather. I'll be here when you come back. Yeah. Winter arrived with the particular commitment that Wyoming winters had, not dramatic, but total the cold settling in, like a guest who intended to stay for months rather than days. The bunkhouse held 3 women through the cold. Lynn chose to stay rather than move on, and Caleb began to think she might be a permanent addition to the ranch's life. She had developed a particular ease with the horses that went beyond skill into something like relationship, and she had begun helping Mei Lin with the garden planning for the spring, spending evenings at the kitchen table with seed catalogs and the careful attention of someone who had found unexpectedly something they were good at. One evening in January, Caleb came in from checking on a horse that had been off her feed to find the cabin full. Mei Lin and Bao and Nian all gathered around the kitchen table, four sets of hands working at different tasks, four quiet voices filling the space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. He stood in the doorway for a moment without anyone noticing him and thought about the cabin as it had been 12 years ago when he'd first arrived and as it had been even 2 years ago, empty of everything except the minimum required to keep a man alive. He was glad the minimum had stopped being enough. Mei Lin looked up and saw him standing there. "Come in," she said. "Close the door, you're letting the cold in." He came in and closed the door, and someone moved to make room for him at the table, and the quiet voices continued, and it was exactly as ordinary and exactly as extraordinary as that. In February, Lynn announced she was leaving. She had received a letter from family in San Francisco. Older siblings she had lost contact with years before who had found her through the marshal's office and wanted her to come home. She told Mei Lin first, which Caleb thought was right. Mei Lin helped her pack, gave her advice about traveling safely, pressed money into her hands even when Lynn protested, stood at the gate of the ranch, the same gate where she herself had once stood in the cold, waiting for a decision to be made, and held Lynn's hands before she climbed into the wagon that would take her toward the railway station. "Write to me," Mei Lin said. "Let me know you arrived safely." Lynn hugged her tightly. Caleb watched Mei Lin's arms come around this young woman who was leaving, and the tenderness in it, genuine unperformed, was the kind of thing you had to look away from slightly because it was too concentrated. "You saved my life," Lynn said against Mei Lin's shoulder, "not just by giving me somewhere to stay, by showing me it was possible to survive this, to be more than what happened to you." After the wagon disappeared down the road, Mei Lin was quiet for the rest of the day. "She'll be all right," Caleb said that evening. "I know," Mei Lin said. "That's not, I know she'll be all right. I'm just going to miss her." "That's allowed," Caleb said. She leaned against him on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the cold February dark settle over the prairie. "It works," Mei Lin said quietly after a while. "What we're doing here. It's not perfect. I don't always know what the right thing is. But it works. Lynn is proof of it." "You're proof of it," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said, "about San Francisco." Caleb waited. "Mrs. Wong wrote again last month. She says the shop, my shop, mine, and Wei's, the men who took it are long gone. The building has been empty for over a year. She thinks with the right legal help, I might be able to get it back." Caleb was quiet, absorbing this. "I want to go," Mei Lin said. "I need to go, not to stay, but to close that chapter properly. Reclaim what was ours, or at least the right to say it was ours. Visit Wei's grave. See the people who knew me when I was a different version of myself." "Then go," Caleb said. She turned to look at him. "You're sure? You just told me you need to be able to manage the ranch on your own," he said. "And I need to trust that you can go somewhere and come back. That you don't have to choose between your old life and this one." He paused. "You should be able to have both." Mei Lin looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to look at the dark prairie. "I'll go in spring," she said. "After the planting. 6 weeks, maybe 8. "I'll be here," Caleb said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know," she said. Spring came late that year, dragging its feet through April, as if reconsidering. But by May, the prairie was committed to it, green, pushing up through the soil, the horses shedding their winter coats in great untidy clumps, the air carrying that particular warmth that felt like relief after the long Wyoming cold. The garden expanded. Mei Lin had planned it through the winter months with Lynn's help, and what emerged in the second year was twice the size of the first, an orderly system of raised beds and trellises and planned rotations that made the original plot look like a sketch compared to a finished drawing. She had ordered seeds from 3 separate suppliers, including a woman in San Francisco. Mrs. Wong had connected her to who dealt specifically in Chinese vegetables. Everything she planted with intention. "This one here," she said to Caleb one morning, crouching beside a new bed near the east fence, "is going to take 3 seasons before it produces properly. But it'll produce for 15 years after that." "Something your mother grew," he guessed. Mei Lin looked at him, slightly startled that he'd gotten it right. "Her mother grew it," she said. 3 generations. She smoothed the soil carefully around the newly planted seeds. "I don't know if it will survive here. The winters are harder than anything in my family's growing history. But I want to try mine." Caleb crouched beside her. If it doesn't grow, you try again next year. And if it doesn't grow, then you try again the year after. She looked at him. That's very patient. Some things are worth being patient for, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she smiled and turned back to the soil. The women in the bunkhouse changed through the spring. Nian moved on in March, finding work in Red Hollow at the restaurant that had opened the previous year. Baustade had made herself indispensable in a way that neither Caleb nor Maylin had anticipated, and showed no signs of wanting to leave. Two new women arrived in April, both younger, both further from what had happened to them than Lynn had been, and closer than Bao. The ranch had developed a kind of expertise in itself. Not formal, not systematized, but real. They knew what the first weeks were like and what helped, what questions not to ask and when to ask them, how to give people space that didn't feel like abandonment. Mary Chen visited monthly and brought information connections, the steady, reliable presence of someone who believed in what they were doing and showed it through action rather than declaration. Caleb built a second small structure in late April, not another bunkhouse, but a workshop with a good-sized table and tools where anyone who wanted to could learn to make things with their hands. He'd noticed that people who were good with their hands and had nowhere to put that goodness became restless in a particular way, and restlessness of that kind could curdle into something harder. Lynn had told him this in one of her letters from San Francisco. She was working now, living with her siblings, learning to be a person in a different world. She wrote monthly, sometimes shorter letters, sometimes long ones. She always wrote to both of them, addressing the envelope to Mr. and Mrs. Merritt with the careful formality that felt like respect. Maylin left for San Francisco in late May. They said goodbye at the ranch, not at the railway station by her preference. She wanted the last thing she saw of home before she went to be home, itself not a platform full of strangers. She was wearing traveling clothes. She'd made herself practical and well cut. Nothing like the pink dress. The pink dress was folded carefully in her trunk, wrapped in muslin. It was coming with her because some things you carry when you go back to a place even when you're not sure why. 6 weeks, she said, adjusting the clasp on her trunk. Or 8, Caleb said. Take the time you need. I'll telegraph when I arrive. And when things are settled, and... I know, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a great deal that could have been said and wasn't because it didn't need to be. 2 years of small daily moments had built a language between them that didn't require words for most of what mattered. He kissed her. She held his face in her hands for a moment before she stepped back the way she had done before the hearing in Cheyenne, as if memorizing. I'm coming back, she said. I know, he said. The wagon took her down the road toward the railway station, and he watched it until it went over the first ridge and was gone. Then he turned back to the ranch, the garden, the bunkhouse, the horses, and went to work. 10. The first telegram came 3 days later, arrived safely. City very loud. Miss the quiet. Love, M. Caleb read it in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and felt the particular quality of her absence, specific, not generic. The chair where she usually sat was empty. The kitchen smelled of whatever Bao had been cooking, not of Maylin's particular choices. The morning light came through the east window and fell on the table at the same angle it always did, and somehow that was the detail that hit him. The light didn't change for her absence, but everything underneath it did. He put the telegram in the same place he'd put his grandfather's letter and went back to work. Telegrams came every few days after that, brief but regular legal matters proceeding. Mrs. Wong's network, invaluable, visited Wei's grave, found it well tended. He read each one twice and filed them and tried not to count days. Bao, who had the particular perceptiveness of someone who had survived by reading situations accurately, said nothing directly about any of this, but brought him tea. He hadn't asked for on the evenings when the silence in the cabin became thick in a way that announced itself. He appreciated her company in the way he had learned to appreciate Mei Lin's by noticing when it was gone. On the 30th day, a telegram arrived that made him sit down. It read, legal matters settled. Shop is mine. Have a decision to make. We'll explain when home. 2 weeks more. Love you, M. Decision to make. He read the telegram 4 times. Then he put it in his coat pocket against his chest. He told himself he wasn't worried, that Maylin had said she was coming home and meant it, that a decision to make wasn't the same as a decision made, that she had too much intelligence and too much self-knowledge to confuse nostalgia for San Francisco with a desire to return to it permanently, and too much honesty to come back if she didn't want to. He told himself all of this and believed most of it, and still spent 2 restless weeks finding extra work to do in the evenings when the ranch had gone quiet. The 2 weeks passed as 2 weeks do. On the morning of the day her train was due, Caleb rode to the railway station hours early. He told himself it was practical better to be there and waiting than to arrive and find she'd already been waiting for him. The platform was full of the usual activity of a place where people arrived and departed, and Caleb stood to one side and watched the crowd and thought about the first time he'd seen Maylin at his gate in the dark wearing that pink dress. The train pulled in, and passengers began to disembark, and for a long, terrible moment he didn't see her. Then he did. She was stepping down from the second car. She was wearing different clothes than she'd left in something more elegant, the kind of thing a person wore in a city. Her hair was done differently. She carried herself differently, too, in a way he couldn't quite name immediately. But when she turned her head and saw him, whatever that difference was collapsed back into her usual self, and she crossed the platform at something close to a run. He caught her, and she held on in the way she had after the hearing, both hands her face against his chest, her breathing uneven. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you," he said, "every day." She pulled back enough to look at him. "The decision," he said. "I sold the shop," she said. "I already have a buyer, someone Mrs. Wong connected me with, who will use the space well. A school for the community." She paused. "The money from the sale is coming here. It's enough to build properly a real house, not just the cabin. Bigger, better, more room for," she gestured, indicating everything the gesture could hold. "For all of it." "You're sure?" he said. "The shop was Way's and mine," she said. "It was important that it be mine again, that I reclaim the right to it. But it was a chapter, Caleb, not the book." She met his eyes. "The book is here. You're here, the garden and the women in the bunkhouse and the horses and the three-generation plant that probably won't survive the winter, but I'm going to try for 15 years if I have to." She paused. "Home isn't the place. Home is the person. I learned that in San Francisco. I kept looking for it in the things I remembered, and I found it in the thing I couldn't wait to get back to." Caleb looked at her. "That's us," she said. "That's home." He kissed her there on the railway platform in front of everyone, not caring. She laughed against his mouth. "There are people watching," she said. "I know," he said. She laughed again, and they walked to the horses together and rode out of the city, and the prairie opened up around them, and the sky was enormous, and everything that needed to be said had been said. Wow. They were planning the new house before they'd been home a week. Maylin had spent time in San Francisco thinking about what she wanted, and she came to the planning table with the precision she brought to everything, detailed and practical, rooted in understanding what was actually needed rather than what looked impressive from outside. "The main room needs to be large enough for everyone," she said, spreading her sketched plans across the kitchen table. "Not just us. All of it, the women from the bunkhouse, any guests, enough space for a real meal together. Kitchen, larger than this." She tapped the current kitchen wall. "Twice the size. Maybe more. I've been cooking for 6 people on a surface designed for one, and Bao has been a saint about not complaining." Caleb looked at his thumbs. They were rough but coherent, a person who thought spatially, who could see how rooms related to each other and what moved through them. "Bedrooms. 3 at least. Ours. One for guests. One that can be for," she paused briefly, "other purposes depending on what we need it for." Caleb looked at her over the plans. "Other purposes," he said. "I'm 30 years old," Maylin said without looking up from the sketches. "I'm aware of how bodies work and how time works. I'm not ready to discuss it as a plan, but I'm also not prepared to design a house as if it will never be anything other than what it is right now." Caleb was quiet for the moment. "That's a reasonable approach." "It's a practical approach," she said. Then she looked up. "Is that all right with you, the not discussing it as a plan, but also not pretending it isn't something we're both aware of?" "Yes," he said, "completely." She held his gaze for a moment, checking. Then she nodded and looked back at the plans. "The porch needs to wrap around," she said, "east and west, so we can watch both the sunrise and the sunset from the same structure." "That's not practical," Caleb said. "That's purely aesthetic." "Yes," Maylin said calmly. "I want it." Caleb looked at the sketch. Then he took the pencil from her and drew the porch wrapping around the east side. "Both sides," she said. He extended it around the west. She nodded, satisfied. "You know," he said, "for someone who started this arrangement by describing herself as purely practical, I contain multitudes," Maylin said. He laughed. She smiled at her plans. The letter from his grandfather's lawyer arrived 2 weeks later. Caleb's grandfather had died in January before Caleb's letter had reached him, which meant he'd never known his grandson had found him again. had never read the 3 pages about Wyoming and the ranch and the woman who had proposed marriage at gunpoint. Caleb read the letter twice, set it down, went outside and stood at the fence line for a while looking at the prairie. Maylin came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, and after a while she put her hand through his arm and he covered her hand with his. He died not knowing, Caleb said. He knew you existed, Maylin said. He knew who you were. The letter not arriving doesn't change what you both were to each other. I waited 12 years. You sent the letter, she said. That was the right thing. The fact that it was late doesn't undo that it was right. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The lawyer says he left me something, he said. Books mostly, 3,000 books. Maylin looked at him. He also left me money, Caleb said. Enough to build the house, enough to build it properly. Maylin was quiet beside him. He knew, Caleb said. Somehow he knew even without the letter. Or he guessed. Or he just decided that whatever had happened, the book should go somewhere, they'd be read. He sounds like he was exactly what you said he was, Maylin said. They stood together at the fence line as the sun moved across the sky, and the prairie did what it did, went on and on and on in every direction, vast and patient and indifferent to everything except the weather. Eventually, Maylin said, we should build a proper library in the new house. 3,000 books take up considerable space. Then we built considerable space, she said. Caleb looked at her. She was looking at the prairie, and her expression was the one he had learned to associate with her when she was deciding something, not deliberating but confirming. Something she already knew. What are you thinking, he asked. That your grandfather gave you the idea that a different kind of life was possible, she said. And that he never stopped believing that even when you were gone for 12 years, that's worth honoring. She paused. A library name for him, in the new house. Caleb was quiet. You don't have to, she said. I want to, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, then straightened. Come inside, she said. The plans need revision. We need a bigger room on the east side. He followed her inside. The evening was warm and full of light, and the kitchen smelled of whatever Bao had been preparing, and somewhere outside Lynn's latest letter was waiting on the table to be read aloud. The house they were going to build existed already in Maylin's careful sketches. The ranch existed already in the work of daily life, in the women in the bunkhouse, in the garden, and the horses. Their life together existed already in 1,000 small choices, each one made and maintained and built upon the ones before it. What was coming was simply more of the same, more ordinary, extraordinary days. More mornings with coffee and the specific pleasure of another person's presence. More evenings on a porch that would wrap around two sides of a house so they could watch both sunrise and sunset from the same structure, which was impractical and aesthetic and exactly right. Caleb sat down at the table. Maylin unrolled the plans. They got to work. The autumn of the third year was the one that would stand out in Caleb's memory later when he thought about the shape of their life together. Not because of any single large thing. Nothing dramatic occurred that fall. No legal battles, no Crane or Voss, no strangers at the gate with impossible demands. It was simply a season of small, accumulating, good things, each one unremarkable in itself, which is perhaps why the whole of them stood out with such clarity, the specific texture of ordinary life working the way ordinary life is supposed to work. The new house was half built. Caleb and Ellis and Frank's son worked through September and October on the main structure, and Maylin supervised the interior progress with the particular precision she brought to everything she cared about. The kitchen expanded to twice its previous size. The library room took shape on the east side, framed out and waiting for 3,000 books that were making their way west by rail in a series of crates. The garden had that year produced everything Maylin had planted. Even the 3-generation plant, the one she'd said would take 3 seasons and might not survive. The Wyoming winters had put up tentative shoots in late August, not flowering, not producing, but alive. It survived, she said, kneeling beside it one evening. One winter isn't the test, Caleb said. No, she agreed, but it's a start. Bao had made herself so entirely a part of the ranch's life that the question of her leaving had stopped being asked. She was somewhere between employee and family, occupying a role that didn't have a precise name which seemed to suit her. She had a gift for administration, for keeping track of what was needed and when, for communicating with Mary's network about incoming women, for making sure that the small community the ranch had become moved forward with the minimum of friction. 2 women came through that fall and moved on by winter. One stayed, a woman named Ada, who had a skill with fabric and had begun teaching whoever was interested how to sew properly, producing from the workshop a series of remarkably useful items that Malin had begun selling through Frank's store in Red Hollow. The money was small but real, and more importantly, Ada had found something that was hers in a way she hadn't had before. "That's how it works," Malin told Caleb one evening, watching Ada through the workshop window, bent over her work, entirely concentrated. "You don't heal by resting. You heal by finding what you're good at and doing it until you remember that you're a person who's good at things." "Is that how it worked for you?" "Animals," she said, "and the horses, the garden, things that needed me to show up every day and pay attention. Things that got better when I was consistent with them." She paused. "And you needed me to show up and pay attention too." "I did," Caleb agreed. She smiled at him sideways in the way she had the private, specific smile that was only for him. One November evening, with the first cold coming back into the air and the light lasting shorter every day, Caleb came inside from checking on the animals to find Malin sitting very still at the kitchen table. She had a cup of tea in front of her that had gone cold. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked up. "I think so," she said. "I just have something to tell you." He sat down. "I went to see the doctor in Red Hollow last week," she said. "When I went in for supplies, I've been feeling strange and I wanted to make sure it wasn't anything serious." "And," he said carefully. Malin looked at him, and then she smiled slowly the way the spring came to Wyoming that year, tentative at first, then committed. "Nothing serious," she said. "Nothing serious at all." Caleb understood what she was saying before she said it, and understood it in his body first. A wave of something that was too large and too compound to call just one thing. Joy, yes. Fear, yes. The sense of the future opening up in a direction he had wanted without letting himself want it. When he managed. "Early summer," she said. "The doctor said early summer." Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. She held on with both of hers. "Are you," he started. "Terrified," she said immediately. "And more happy than I know how to say." She paused. "Both. Very much both." "Me too," he said. They sat together in the warm kitchen, while outside the Wyoming autumn went about its business, and inside the fire crackled, and Caleb held his wife's hands across the table and thought about the morning more than 2 years ago, when she had stood at his gate in the cold, offering him an impossible choice. He had found a third way then, and the third way had led step by step to this table, this kitchen, these hands in his. Every choice had led here, every ordinary, extraordinary day. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Niente. That winter was the gentlest in Caleb's 12 years on the ranch, or perhaps it only seemed that way. The cold came as it always did, and the snow piled against the cabin walls, and the horses grew their thick winter coats, and the days shortened to almost nothing. But inside the half-finished new house, in the existing cabin, in the bunkhouse, there was warmth enough from fires and bodies and the accumulated heat of a community of people who had decided each in their own way that this place was worth being present for. Malin moved through the winter with characteristic competence and a new slowness that she seemed to accept as practical rather than resent as limiting. She still went to the garden every morning to check on what was dormant and what needed attention. She still managed the household accounts and the communications with Mary's network, and the planning for spring planning spread across the kitchen table like a map of intentions. But she also, more than before, simply sat. Caleb would come in from the morning work to find her at the window with a cup of tea watching the snow on the prairie. He had learned through 2 years of paying close attention that this was not vacancy. She was thinking, processing, being present with something interior. He had learned not to interrupt it unless he had a reason. One morning in February, she said without turning from the window, "I've been thinking about names." "What kind of names?" "The kind a person carries their whole life." She looked at him. "Not yet, I know it's too early to decide, but I've been thinking about the question. And in my family, names are meant to say something about what you hope for the person," she said. "What you believe they can become." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to give a name that holds both worlds, something that works in both languages, something that says you belong to all of this." Caleb was quiet. "Way would have had opinions about this," she said. "Not sad exactly, thoughtful. He kept lists, I told you. He would have had a list of names with notes about each one." She paused. "I don't think I'm betraying him by wanting this. I think I'm continuing something. He wanted me to be safe and happy. He would have wanted this for me." "I think you're right," Caleb said. She looked at him. "You didn't know him." "No, but I know what you've told me about him. And what you've told me is that he was a man who loved you enough to want you to be alive and well even past him." He paused. "That's not a love that would want you to be lonely." Malin held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Hope, she said. I keep coming back to that word. It says what it means in English. And the sound of it, she said it in Cantonese, the same word shaded differently by her mother tongue, is also beautiful in mine. Hope, Caleb said. If it's a girl, Malin said. And if it's a boy, then we'll need a different list, she said. But I think it's a girl. How do you know? She shrugged with the serenity of someone who has decided to trust their instincts after years of learning which ones to trust. I just know. Caleb looked at his wife in the winter light with the snow-covered prairie behind her through the window and the fire behind him in the quiet of a morning that belonged entirely to them. He thought about the ranch as it had been when he'd built it, a place to disappear, a place to be alone, a fortress against a world that had wanted too much from him. And he thought about what it had become, a home that held other people's lives alongside their own, a place where the word refuge meant something real and specific, a garden growing things 3 generations old. He thought about the morning Malin had stood at his gate in the cold, and what she had asked him for, and what he had given her instead. A third way, a choice beyond the 2 she could see. He thought she gave me the same thing. Every day since then, she has been the third way I couldn't see before she arrived. Hope, he said again. Yes, Malin said. Outside, the snow continued to fall, patient and vast, covering the prairie, in the clean white silence that always came before the spring. Spring came early in the 4th year. Caleb noticed it the way he always noticed things that mattered not all at once but in accumulation. The particular quality of the light in early March, different from February's light in ways he couldn't articulate but felt in his body. The sound of water moving somewhere beneath the still frozen ground. The horse's behavior changing before there was anything to change it for some deep animal knowledge ahead of the visible world. The new house was finished in April. They moved in on a clear morning when the air still held winter's edge, but the sky was a specific blue that promised warmth was coming. Bao and Ada carried things from the old cabin. Lynn's most recent letter was read aloud in the new main room while it was still echoing and mostly empty, giving her voice an acoustic presence she wouldn't have expected. The kitchen was enormous and smelled of new wood and possibility. The library room waited bookshelves built and empty for the crates that were making their slow way west. The bedroom was Caleb's and Mei Lin's together, undivided, unmistakably theirs. The porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house. Mei Lin stood on the east porch in the morning and on the west porch in the evening and watched the Wyoming sky do what Wyoming skies did, which was more than most skies attempted, and her expression at both times was the one Caleb associated with her when she was receiving something she had earned. He stood beside her mostly, when the work allowed it. The planting season arrived, and Mei Lin managed the garden from increasing proximity to the house as her body's demands shifted. She directed operations with the authority of someone who had learned this land through years of close attention and could tell Bao and Ada what needed doing from a porch chair if she had to. She had the 3-generation plant moved to the new garden bed near the east wall, where it would get morning sun and be visible from her window. Sentimental, Caleb said. Entirely, Mei Lin agreed. Bang. Hope was born on a June morning. Labor began slowly in the gray hours before dawn, and Caleb would think later that it was appropriate, something that important beginning in the quiet dark announced first by small signs. Mary arrived at sunrise calm and capable in the way she was calm and capable about most things, and Caleb was sent to the kitchen to keep the fire going and wait and be useful in the ways he could be useful from outside the room where everything was happening. He was not good at waiting. Bao sat with him at the kitchen table and didn't talk much, which he appreciated. Ada appeared occasionally with something to do with her hands and disappeared again. The women in the bunkhouse were a quiet presence somewhere beyond the window. Caleb drank coffee he didn't taste and listened and counted his heartbeats and tried not to calculate how long it had been since he'd last heard Mei Lin's voice through the bedroom wall. Then he heard a different voice, new and enormous, thin and insistent, filling the house with the sound of itself. Mary appeared in the doorway. Come, she said. Mei Lin was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has done something that required everything. She was propped against the pillows with her hair loose and her face pale, and her eyes burning with an exhaustion that was also beneath it something else entirely. In her arms was a small red creature who had apparently decided that the world required immediate commentary and was providing it. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. Mei Lin held their daughter out to him, and he took her, and the creature immediately stopped making noise and looked at him with the unfocused intensity of a person who has just arrived somewhere and is taking everything in. Hello, Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. The baby looked at him. She knows your voice, Maylin said. Her voice was barely a whisper. She's been hearing it for months. Caleb looked at his dog, her dark hair, her small fists, her face doing the extraordinary work of being a face, and felt something that had no name, but that he recognized as the arrival of something that had always been coming. Hope, he said. Hope, Maylin confirmed. He handed her back. Maylin held her against her chest and looked down with the expression Caleb had come to know she wore when she was fully present, not performing presence, but actually there entirely in the moment she was in. Are you all right? He asked. I'm perfect, she said, and it wasn't bravado. It was a statement of fact. The summer moved around Hope the way the household had learned to move around the people it held, accommodating, attentive, finding the shape that worked. Maylin healed with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything, and was back in the garden before anyone thought she would be, though she moved more slowly and accepted help with the heavier work without the friction that might have characterized it a year before. Hope spent her earliest weeks in a cradle Caleb had built. Not elegantly, he was a better rancher than carpenter, but solid and safe, and was transferred frequently between arms, Caleb's, Maylin's, Bow's, Ada's, the women in the bunkhouse who took turns holding her with the seriousness of people who had been deprived of ordinary life and knew the value of its textures. Lynn wrote from San Francisco with great delight about the baby's existence. She was coming west in the fall, she said, to visit properly. She had news. She had saved money. She had things to discuss. Caleb's grandfather's books arrived in August 32, crates each one requiring careful examination before shelving. He and Maylin spent evenings that month in the library room, opening crates and sorting and organizing handling volumes that carried the specific smell of age and attention. Maylin read the margin notes. He was a thoughtful reader, she said one evening, sitting cross-legged on the library floor with a volume of natural history open in her lap, Hope asleep against her shoulder. He was a thoughtful person, Caleb said. You're like him, she said, the way you hold things. You don't make them into more than they are, but you don't make them into less either. She looked up. He would have liked you. He would have liked you more, Caleb said. Probably. Maylin agreed entirely without false modesty, which made him laugh. They shelved the books over the course of several evenings. The library room filled shelf by shelf and became the thing it was supposed to be, the kind of room that told you something about the people who had built it. On the last evening, when the final crate was emptied and the last book was on its shelf, they stood in the doorway together and looked at what they had made. What should we call it? Maylin asked. I thought we'd already decided, for my grandfather. We'll put his name on the door, she said. But I meant, what do we call it for us for what it means here? Caleb thought about it. The room where things last, he said. Maylin looked at him. That's good, she said. She reached up and touched the door frame briefly, the way you touch something that belongs to you and that you're glad to have. Now, autumn arrived, and with it Lynn. She came with a companion, a woman named Jessie, who she introduced with a directness that Caleb appreciated immediately. This is Jessie. She's important to me. I wanted you to meet her. Maylin embraced Lynn and then Jessie with equal warmth and showed them both the garden and the library and the porch that wrapped around two sides of the house, and introduced them to Hope, who regarded all newcomers with the same expression of careful assessment she had apparently inherited from her mother. They stayed for a week. Lynn had money saved and a plan. She was going to open a business in San Francisco. Nothing grand yet, she said, but a start. She had been corresponding with a woman in Mrs. Wong's network who was doing something similar in Chinatown and thought there might be room for a partnership. You sound like her, Caleb said, indicating Maylin. Lynn smiled. She taught me, not on purpose, just by being how she is. On the last morning before Lynn and Jessie left, Caleb came out to the east porch to find Lynn standing there alone, looking at the Wyoming prairie in the specific early morning light that Maylin also liked to stand in. Thank you, Lynn said without turning. You don't have to. I do, she said. She turned to look at him. I know what this place is. I know what you and Maylin built here. I know what it cost. She paused. I needed somewhere safe to be long enough to figure out what safe felt like. You gave me that. It changed everything. Caleb looked at her. 23 now, or somewhere near it, standing straight in the morning light, clear-eyed, going towards something she had chosen. You did the work, he said. We just gave you somewhere to do it. Lynn shook her head slightly, the way people do when they disagree politely. Then she went inside to pack. After she and Jessie rode away, Maylin stood at the gate and watched the road until nothing was visible. She's going to be fine, Caleb said. Better than fine, Maylin said. She's going to be exceptional. She turned from the gate, and for a moment she was just standing there at the gate at the exact place where she herself had stood more than 3 years ago, wearing the pink silk dress in the pre-dawn cold with men somewhere in the dark behind her, and an impossible ultimatum in her mouth, and a bet on a stranger's character that had turned out to be right. Caleb watched her stand in that spot and understood what she was doing. "I want to wear it today," she said. "The dress?" "Yes." She looked at him. "I brought it out of the trunk this morning. I want to wear it." "Then wear it," he said. She went inside and came back wearing the pink silk dress mended now to near invisibility, the tears gone, the fabric still improbably bright in the autumn morning. She wore it with her hair braided and her boots on entirely practical beneath the impossible formal color, and she looked like herself, the thing that hadn't changed through all the changes, the essential Maylene that had been there at the gate, and was here now at the same gate looking at the same land. Caleb came to stand beside her. They looked at the ranch together, the new house with its library and its wraparound porch, the garden in its autumn abundance, the bunkhouse where Ada was already moving around in the workshop light, the corral where the horses grazed in the particular unhurried way of animals who had never had reason to be afraid of where they lived. "Tell me what you see," Maylin said. "Home," Caleb said simply. She nodded. "Me too, but tell me more." He looked. He tried to see it the way she was asking, not the list of structures and functions, but the meaning underneath them. What it was. "I see a place where people come when they need to find out what they're still capable of," he said. "I see a garden that was planted by someone who wasn't sure she'd be allowed to stay to prove she could make things grow anywhere. I see a library for a man I never got to properly thank." He paused. "I see a life I didn't plan for, and that turned out to be everything I needed." Maylin was quiet for a moment. "I see the same things," she said, "and one more." "What?" She looked at him. "I see the gate where I stood 3 years ago ready to die, and the man who walked toward me and chose a third way when I could only see two." She paused. "That's what I see when I look at any of this. That choice, that morning, everything that came from it." Caleb looked at her, the woman who had appeared out of the dark in a torn pink dress with an ultimatum and a desperate gamble on a stranger's decency, and had turned out to be not a problem to be solved, but a person to be known, and had over 3 years become the most specific and necessary presence in his world. "I would make the same choice again," he said. "I know," Maylin said. "So would I." Inside, hope was beginning to wake small, insistent sounds that would become louder if left unaddressed. Bao's voice, calm and warm, was already there ahead of them. Maylin took Caleb's hand. They stood for one more moment at the gate, at the beginning of everything in the autumn morning light that made the pink dress look like a deliberate choice against all that golden brown. Then she turned and he turned with her, and they walked home. No. 3 years earlier, a woman in a torn pink silk dress had stood at a rancher's gate before dawn, shivering in the snow, and made an impossible demand of a stranger. She had not found what she came looking for. She had found something that could not have been planned for, could not have been seen from the vantage point of that frozen gate, could not have been put into words at the time because the words hadn't existed yet. She had found a third way. The rancher who had walked toward her out of the dark, rifle in hand, had found the same thing, though he hadn't known it either that cold morning. He had only known that he would not choose either of the options she'd offered him, and that refusing both had felt like the only honest response to someone who deserved more than the choice between two bad endings. What grew from that refusal? A marriage that began as paper and became real. A legal battle won not by money but by truth and preparation and the willingness to stand up and say clearly what had happened. A community that grew around a shared understanding of what safety meant and what it cost and what it was worth. What grew from that refusal? A garden with 3-generation plants in the soil. A library for a quiet man in Philadelphia who had believed, even without knowing the outcome, that his grandson would find his way. A house with a wraparound porch where sunrise and sunset could both be watched from the same structure, because that was impractical and exactly right. What grew from that refusal? A daughter named Hope, who had arrived in early summer and had already begun the work of becoming whoever she was going to be. The woman in the pink dress had asked for death or marriage, for freedom or protection. What she received was something that contained all of those things and was larger than any of them, a life that was entirely, stubbornly, beautifully her own. The rancher who had caught her when her legs gave out at the gate, who had carried her to the fire and said, "You're safe right now, in this moment you're safe," had found that safety for him had always looked like this. Not the absence of threat, not the walls built high enough, but a life shared with someone who made the daily work of staying worth doing. Outside, the Wyoming autumn went about its enormous, indifferent business. The sky did what Wyoming skies do. The prairie extended in every direction, patient, ancient belonging to no one and everyone. Inside, the fire crackled. Someone was laughing. Hope made her small, insistent presence known. Caleb Merritt and Malin Merritt were home. They had chosen it. They kept choosing it. That was how it stayed. The winter of the fourth year was the first winter they spent entirely in the new house. The old cabin stood empty on the north side of the property. Not torn down, not repurposed, yet just there, the way things that have served their full purpose sometimes stand for a while before anyone decides what to do with them next. Caleb thought he'd feel something particular about this, about moving out of the space where so much had happened. What he actually felt was that the things that had happened there had moved with them, absorbed into whatever they'd become, and the empty cabin was just wood and stone. Malin felt differently, which he had expected. "It's where everything began," she said, standing in the old cabin doorway one November afternoon while Hope slept on her back in the carrier they'd made. "It'll still be there," Caleb said. "That's not, I know it'll still be there." She looked at the empty room, the stone fireplace, the table where they'd sat the night she'd told him about Way in San Francisco and the men who had taken her shop. "I want to do something with it, something that honors what it was." "What are you thinking?" "Not sure yet," she said. "Something that says this is where it started." She thought about it through the winter. Caleb didn't press. He had learned that Malin's thinking was its own form of work, and interrupting it was like pulling up a plant to see if the roots had taken. The answer came in February, when a woman arrived from Cheyenne, older perhaps 50, named Ruth, who had been a school teacher before circumstances that she didn't fully describe had made teaching impossible. She could read and write in English, and had some knowledge of arithmetic and history. She was beneath the wariness of recent difficulty, clearly someone who had spent years helping other people learn things and missed doing it. Malin talked with her for 2 evenings. Then she came to Caleb. "The old cabin," she said. "Yes. A school," she said. "Small, for whoever needs it, the women who come through, people in the area who haven't had access to education. Ruth to teach." She paused. Can we do that?" Caleb thought about it. The cabin was solid. He'd built it that way. It would need a good stove, new windows, decent light. "Yes," he said, "we can do that." They spent March converting the old cabin. Caleb installed a larger stove and 2 new windows on the south side to bring in the light. Malin and Ruth designed the arrangement of the single room together, a practical discussion that quickly became something more. The two of them bent over a sketch, Ruth suggesting modifications with the authority of someone who knew from experience how children and adults learn differently in the same space. They were not starting a school formally. They were starting something that didn't have a name yet in a place that had been a refuge before it was anything else, and that felt right. The first lesson was on an April morning. 3 women from the bunkhouse were all at different levels of English literacy. Ruth at the front of the room that had once been Caleb's entire world, moving through material with the patient specificity of someone who had been waiting for this. Caleb stood in the doorway for a few minutes and watched, and then went to his own work. Ma'am. Spring announced itself through the garden. Malin had spent the winter planning with the same thorough attention she'd given the previous years. But this year she had Ruth's involvement. It turned out Ruth had grown up on a farm in Ohio and had strong opinions about soil management that were, Malin admitted, largely correct and complementary to her own knowledge. The 3-generation plant was in its 3rd winter. The shoots that had appeared the previous August had been carefully covered for the cold and were in March showing signs of persistence. Malin checked on them every morning with the expression of someone tracking a long-running project whose outcome was not yet determined, but whose progress was real. "This year," Caleb asked one morning. "Maybe," Malin said. "Possibly flowers, not fruit yet, but maybe flowers." She didn't overstate what this meant, but Caleb had watched her stand at that plant for 3 years now and understood that whatever it meant it completely. Hope, 6 months old and increasingly opinionated about the world she found herself in, was beginning to sit up unassisted and had developed an apparent conviction that any object within her reach was worth putting in her mouth. She had Malin's eyes and Caleb's stubbornness, which Malin pointed out regularly with an expression that suggested she found this more amusing than concerning. "She's going to be difficult," Malin said one evening, watching Hope systematically examine and attempt to consume a wooden spoon. "She comes by it honestly," Caleb said. Malin gave him the look that meant she was deciding whether to respond to that and chose not to. Mary Chen visited in April and stayed for 3 days, the longest she'd stayed since the early months. She sat in on 2 of Ruth's lessons and talked with Bao about the network and spent an evening on the porch with Mei Lin that Caleb absented himself from, understanding it was not his conversation to be part of. When Mary left, Mei Lin was quiet for the rest of the day. "All right," Caleb asked that evening. "Yes," she said. "Mary, as she carries a great deal. More than people know. I was trying to give some of it back to her for a few hours." "Did it help?" "I think so," Mei Lin said. "I hope so." She looked at Hope, who had fallen asleep in the cradle with one small fist clenched against her chest, as if holding on to something. "I want Hope to know her," Mei Lin said. "When she's old enough to understand what Mary has done, what people like her have done. I don't want her to think the world is simply good or simply cruel. I want her to understand what it looks like when someone chooses goodness deliberately in a world that makes that difficult." "We can start with the people she already knows," Caleb said. Mei Lin looked at him. "That's what I mean," she said. "You're one of them. Bao, Ada, Ruth, Mary." She paused. "People who decided what they stood for and then stood for it even when it cost something." Caleb was quiet. "I want her to grow up surrounded by that," Mei Lin said, "so that it's what normal looks like to her. So that when she encounters the other kind, she has a baseline to measure it against." "She will," Caleb said. "She already does." Hope stirred in her 8-hour sleep and resettled, small fist relaxing. Outside, the spring night was warm enough to have the window open, and the sounds of the prairie came through, distant, familiar, the ordinary texture of the land at rest. Masa. Summer returned. Hope began to crawl with the purposeful determination of someone who has identified a destination and intends to reach it regardless of obstacles. The garden produced everything it had been asked to produce and more. Ruth's school expanded to include 2 children from neighboring ranches whose parents had heard about it and inquired carefully, and then been told, yes, of course, bring them. Caleb added a second row of shelves in the library because 3,000 books filled one wall, and they had since acquired several hundred more. Mei Lin, having a weakness for ordering things that arrived in packages from Cheyenne and San Francisco and occasionally back east. He didn't mind. The library had become the room he thought in, where he sat in the evenings when the work was done and read and thought about things and occasionally wrote letters. To his grandfather's lawyer, wrapping up the last of the estate matters. To Lin, who wrote faithfully every month. To Shu, whose letters were infrequent but warm. Once to the judge in Cheyenne, not about anything legal, just to say that his ruling had mattered more than he might know. The judge wrote back, a short letter, formal but genuine. He said, "I make many rulings. It's good to hear occasionally which ones took root." Caleb put the letter in the library on the shelf nearest the window. "Yeah." The 3-generation plant flowered in late July. Mei Lin found the first bloom in the morning, small, a particular pale yellow, that she said matched something she remembered from her grandmother's garden in Guangdong, a place she had never been, but which had been described to her so precisely and so often that she could sometimes almost see it. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood there in the garden in the early morning, and then she sat down on the low stool she kept near the east bed and stayed there for a while. Caleb came to find her when she didn't come in for breakfast. She looked up at him. Her face was doing several things at once, the particular expression of someone who is feeling something complex and choosing not to simplify it. "It flowered," she said. "I see that. My great-grandmother grew this," she said, "in a place I've never seen. My grandmother carried seeds from it when she left. My mother grew it in a pot in a city apartment because she didn't have a garden. I grew it here." She looked at the small yellow flower. 3 generations of women kept this alive through disruptions I can barely imagine. Wars, displacement, the ordinary violence of being a woman without power in a world that didn't think much of that. And then it came here. Caleb sat down in the garden beside her. "It made it," he said. "It made it," she confirmed, "because someone kept carrying it forward." She paused. "That's what we're doing, isn't it? All of it, the school, the bunkhouse, the women who come through, we're carrying things forward. Not because someone will remember us for it, they won't mostly, but because that's what you do with good things, you keep them alive." Caleb looked at the plant, at the single pale yellow flower that had taken 3 years to arrive. "Yes," he said, "that's what we're doing." Hope was beginning to pull herself upright. Using the garden fence, her small, determined hands gripping the lower rail, her face set with the concentration of a person who has decided that standing is the next thing and is going to accomplish it, whether the relevant muscles cooperate or not. Mei Lin watched her daughter at the fence and then looked at Caleb. "Thank you," she said, For what specifically, he asked. For the gate, she said. For walking toward it that morning, instead of waiting for whatever was coming to announce itself properly. For choosing a third way when I could only see two. Caleb looked at her. The morning light was doing what it did at this hour, making the garden look like something from a painting, the pink dress she'd decided to wear today. Because it was summer and it was hers, the brightest thing in the frame. You gave me the same thing, he said. You just came at it from a different direction. She smiled. The smile he knew best, not the managed one, not the bright, public one, but the specific private one that had been his alone for more than 3 years now, and still felt each time like something he'd been given. Hope let go of the fence with one hand wobbling badly, caught herself, and looked at them both with an expression of triumphant indignation. She's going to walk soon, Malin said. God help us, Caleb said. Malin laughed the full laugh, the one that came from somewhere real. And the morning continued, as mornings do, the garden busy with summer, the ranch going about its work, the old cabin school beginning its day somewhere across the property, the library waiting with its 3,000 books in its window that caught the afternoon light. A life, in other words. The specific, accumulating, ordinary, extraordinary thing. Most situation. That evening, they sat on the west porch and watched the sun go down. It was the kind of Wyoming sunset that made you feel there was more color in the world than you'd previously accounted for, the sky cycling through shades that didn't have adequate names, the prairie below it, catching the last light and holding it as long as it could. Hope was asleep inside Bow, keeping an ear out. The ranch had quieted into its evening rhythms. Somewhere a door closed, somewhere a horse shifted in the corral. Malin had her sketch notebook on her lap but wasn't drawing. She was looking at the sky with the expression she saved for things she was trying to memorize. What are you thinking? Caleb asked. I'm thinking that I want to remember this exactly, she said. This specific evening. The color of the sky right now and the sound of the ranch and you being here. Why this one particularly? She considered. Because it's ordinary, she said. Because it's not the day we got married or the day we won in Cheyenne or the day Hope was born. It's just a summer evening, the kind that will happen many more times. And I want to remember that those are the ones that matter most, the ones where nothing is happening except everything. Caleb looked at the sky. He thought about what she'd said, nothing is happening except everything, and thought it was one of the truest things he'd heard. 3 years ago, he said, I would have described this ranch as a place where nothing happened. And now I understand that nothing happening and everything happening look the same from certain angles, he said. It depends on whether you're paying attention to the right things. Malin looked at him. When did you start paying attention to the right things? He thought about it honestly. The morning a woman in a pink silk dress appeared at my gate and refused to be ignored, he said. She reached over and took his hand. They sat that way while the sky did what it was going to do, and the ranch settled into the dark, and the first stars appeared with the matter-of-fact commitment of things that have always been there and intend to continue being there. I'm glad I ran toward your ranch, Malin said. Specifically yours. That I watched for 4 hours and decided you were the one. Why did you decide that really? She was quiet for a moment. Because you look like someone who had once needed the same thing, she said. Not in the obvious way, just the way you moved through the space you'd made for yourself. Like someone who had built it as a refuge and was still living as if that was its entire purpose. She paused. I thought if that person has room in himself to understand why someone would need to disappear, he might have room to understand me. Caleb was quiet, absorbing this. Were you right, he asked. More than I expected, she said, and in different ways. I thought you'd understand the need to run. I didn't anticipate the rest of it. Which part of the rest of it? She looked at him with the particular directness she had, the thing that had been there from the very beginning at the gate when she looked at him and assessed him and made her impossible demand. The part where you turned out to be exactly who I needed, she said. Not who I thought I needed, who I actually needed. The sky had deepened into the purples and dark blues of late dusk, and the first night insects had begun their business, and the ranch was fully in its evening, now quiet and present and entirely itself. Caleb thought about the morning that had started everything, the blue pre-dawn dark, the horses restless, the shape at the fence line that had resolved into a woman he had never met and would spend the rest of his life beside. He thought about every choice between that morning and this evening, the accumulation of them, the way each one had led to the next and the next until the total of them was a life he couldn't have imagined from the beginning and couldn't imagine now being without. I'm glad I walked toward the gate, he said. So am I, Malin said. The stars came out, more of them, and the prairie dark settled over everything with the profound patience of something that had been doing this for a long time. Inside the house, a lamp was still lit, warm yellow light visible through the window, the house itself present and solid against the dark. They sat on the porch until the chill came back into the air, and then they went inside. The door closed behind them. The ranch went on being itself in the dark. The garden, the horses, the old cabin school, the bunkhouse, the library with its 3,000 books, all of it gathered around the new house that had been built by a man who had spent 12 years hiding and a woman who had spent her whole life being told she didn't matter and who had together decided to build something that meant the opposite. The woman in the pink dress had asked for death or marriage for the end or a beginning. What she had found was something the question hadn't contained room for a life that expanded outward from that frozen gate, like a field of things planted in dark soil, each one carrying something forward that deserved to be carried, each one proof that survival could become more than itself if you gave it enough time and attention and another person willing to tend it alongside you. The gate stood at the edge of the property, the same gate it had always been. The prairie stretched out beyond it in every direction, unchanged by everything that had happened on this small square of it. But inside the gate, in the garden, in the house, in the school, that had been a refuge, first in the heartbeat of a sleeping child who had been named for the thing her parents had chosen to keep practicing even when it was difficult. Everything was different from what it had been. Not because of one morning, because of every morning after it, and the morning after that, and every ordinary, extraordinary morning still to come. The end. 1 year later, Mary Chen came to dinner on the evening of the anniversary. Not planned, not arranged, simply arriving the way she sometimes did when she had been in the area, and knew there would be room at the table and something worth eating. She brought news from Cheyenne. The investigation that had begun with Judge Harrison's directive had continued slowly through the year, as these things did, but had resulted in 3 more arrests and, more importantly, in the formal closure of the operation that had brought Maylin across the prairie in a broken wagon on a November night 4 years before. "It's done," Maylin asked. "Done," Mary said. "The structure that was behind it is dismantled. The men at the top are facing federal charges. It won't erase what happened, but it means it won't keep happening in the same way." Maylin was quiet for a moment. Hope, sitting on the floor between the adults, was engaged in a complex negotiation with a wooden block that she appeared to be on the verge of winning. "Shu knows it," Maylin asked. "She was one of the witnesses who helped make it happen," Mary said. "Her testimony was essential." Maylin looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up, and her expression was the specific one she wore when she was feeling something she had decided to feel fully rather than manage. "Good," she said, "good." The dinner that followed was everything. A dinner in that house by then was crowded and loud and full of the particular energy of people who had chosen to be there, the food. A combination of things. Maylin and Bao had spent the afternoon preparing the conversation, moving between English and Cantonese, and occasional fragments of other languages brought by the women currently staying in the bunkhouse. Ruth sat at one end of the table and listened more than she spoke, which was her way. Ada had made a new tablecloth that was, by general agreement, the best thing anyone had seen in a while. The 2 children who attended the school sat with the slightly formal attention of young people who are aware they are guests at something important. Caleb sat at the other end of the table from where he usually sat and watched the whole of it, the room, the faces, the particular light that the lamps made in a crowded space, and thought, "This is the thing." Not any single part of it, the whole. Mary, catching his eye, raised her glass slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement that passed between them and was seen by nobody else. He raised his in return. After dinner, after the clearing and the washing up, and the gradual dispersal of people toward the bunkhouse and the school cabin and the various private corners of the house, Caleb and Maylin found themselves alone on the west porch. This was by now a habit so established it had stopped being conscious. The west porch after dinner, the day's residue, the stars coming out over the prairie one by one with the unhurried confidence of things that have all the time they need. Hope was asleep. The house behind them breathed with the sounds of a building full of people at rest. 4 years, Maylin said. Yes. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the prairie did what it did, went on, patient and enormous, not caring, and therefore perfectly suited to being the backdrop for a life that did. "What do you want for the next 4?" she asked. Caleb thought about it. Genuinely. "More of this," he said, "and the garden and the school and the women coming through and the library filling up. Hope walking and then running and then being impossible about something specific that we haven't encountered yet." He paused. "You, all of it with you." Maylin was quiet for a moment. "More of this," she agreed. And maybe eventually a second child if we're lucky, if the time is right. She paused. I've been thinking about it. So have I, he said. She looked up at him. When were you going to mention that? When it seemed like the right moment, he said. Like now. She shook her head, but she was smiling. You could just say things. I'm saying it now. You are, she agreed. The porch was quiet. The stars were fully out now. The enormous Wyoming sky, doing what it did when there was no moon to compete with it, filling up with light layer after layer of it. More stars than seemed possible from down here at the bottom of it all. I think about that morning sometimes, Malin said. The gate, what I was feeling. What were you feeling? Like I'd used up everything, she said. Like there was nothing left but the plan. Find this ranch, make this demand, get this outcome or the other one. No version of the plan involved all of this. She gestured, indicating the house, the ranch, the dark around them, everything. I was too tired to imagine all of this. What did you imagine? Safety, she said. Just safety. A place where I could stop running long enough to breathe. That was the extent of it. She paused. You gave me so much more than that. You gave yourself more than that, Caleb said. I gave you the gate. She laughed the laugh that had been for 4 years one of the most specific sounds in his world. You gave me the gate, she agreed. They sat there until the chill became serious, and then they went inside. The house received them warm, solid, full of the breathing of sleeping people, and the residue of a dinner that had been good, and Caleb closed the door behind them and stood for a moment in the hallway before going to bed. Through the library door, he could see the books row on row in the dark, waiting for morning. Through the small window at the end of the hall, the prairie was just barely visible, a dark line below the star-filled sky. He thought about the morning 4 years ago, about a woman in the snow, about a choice made in the cold with everything uncertain and nothing clear, except that some options were wrong and some were right, and you had to trust the difference. He had trusted it. He went to bed. Beside him, Malin was already nearly asleep, her breathing deep and even one hand open on the pillow between them. He lay there in the dark and listened to the ranch around them. Its sounds, its silences, the particular quality of a place that has been lived in and knows it. He thought, this is enough, more than enough. He slept. Outside, the Wyoming night held everything it had always held, the prairie, the stars, the old cabin that had been a refuge and was now a school, the gate at the edge of the property that stood exactly where it had always stood, ordinary and essential, the place where everything had begun. The woman in the pink dress had walked through it 4 years ago with an ultimatum and no plan beyond survival. What she had built on the other side of it, what they had built together, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time, was still growing, still carrying things forward, still choosing every morning to be exactly what it was.